Comic Geek Speak presents Murd's Time Bubble, the 33rd time. Welcome aboard the Time Bubble. This is Adam Murdo, your courageous chrononaut of comics commentary, touching down in the Time Bubble for the very first time in this plague year of 2020, and immediately regretting it. I mean, no offense to you locals, but this year is one off-ramp that any savvy time traveler would have been very happy to have missed. I mean, seriously, couldn't the linear men have posted some kind of warning in the time stream? You know, like a little biohazard symbol or an abandon hope all ye who enter now, or even just like a crudely painted Walking Dead-style screwed inside sign would have been nice, but... I mean, what are my time taxes paying for here? But no, and instead, here and now I am, right here up to my armpits in plague and pestilence, political unrest, economic collapse, wildfires, hurricanes, typhoons, earthquakes, smog! It's just, they're sending everything against us here. This year is truly a mess. I think we can all agree. But you know something, gentle listeners? Even if I had some forewarning about exactly how deep in the manure of 2020 I would be sinking as a consequence of making a stop over here, I still would not have failed to do so. And why? Because I do feel I have kind of an obligation to all of you true believers out there to bring this podcast to you on something like a regular schedule. And it has come to my attention recently that it has been over a year and a half since the last time I recorded a podcast episode. Just go take a look if you want. Just look up the 30-second time on your podcast feed of choice. You'll find that its date of release was April 1st of 2019, and this should be initially reaching your ears in early November of 2020. And do the math, that is 19 months without a transmission. And that is a poor showing even for me. You know, it is for shame. And, you know, just hokey fake time travel talk aside for a moment, I really don't understand how that happened. I mean, even when the pandemic struck and we all had to sequester and quarantine and whatnot, and, you know, you'd think that would have given me a lot of extra time in which to concentrate on something like this, but... And, you know, there have been a few false starts over the past 19 months when I nearly settled in to record this episode that you're about to hear. You know, I have a stack of comics. I've had this stack of comics on hand pretty much since the beginning of summer last year to describe to you all. I've had them tight in my back pocket and ready to go. I've read and reread them what feels like 4 or 5 times now, but somehow I never quite executed for whatever reason, partly inconveniences of the work of my job, which, did go on even during the quarantine. I was somewhat lucky in that, being part of a privately owned small business, I was able to continue going in and working behind the scenes, doing inventory or office work in the absence of the rest of the staff while they were on furlough. So my daily routine during the virus didn't really change that much, for which I feel thankful. But it does mean I didn't have quite as much spare time. Now, while the rest of you were baking bread and doing crossword puzzles or what have you, I should have been podcasting, but instead I didn't do anything more than the standard Comic Geek Speak workload, and the time bubble remained neglected on the to-do pile, and so history ran the course that it did. So yes, I apologize deeply for allowing things to go quite as far in the direction of delinquency as it has. But I'm here now, and I'm now here, and I hope that there are some of you out there who have missed me all this time and have missed these little exegeses of mine. But I do have a small pile of comics here that will take us finally over the threshold into the year 2002, now that we've reached its anagram 2020. And so why don't we just get down to business here and forget about all the vicissitudes of this difficult year for a brief time, and just think about some long ago and far away comics. And boy, have I got one lollapalooza of an extra-sized, extra-significant issue to start things off here on this edition of the Time Bubble. It's one of the most hotly anticipated releases of 2001, and to many also one of its greatest disappointments, perhaps precisely because of how hotly anticipated it was. My friends, we are gazing directly into the great and terrible visage of The Dark Knight Strikes Again, number 1 of 3, or DK DK2 #1, as it's also known, since, after all, this is 2001, and alphanumerically abbreviated titles were all the rage back then. In fact, that's the only way it's identified on the front cover. It's the letter DK2 in 2.5-inch tall characters. 3 little monolithic megaglyphs all in a row. And the only image on said front cover is an enormous bat-gloved fist raised skyward in black silhouette. It looks a little bit like a propaganda poster for socialist revolutionaries, actually, which is somewhat appropriate to the miniseries' theme. So yes, anyway, Dark Knight Strikes Again, or DK2, #1 of 3, 80 pages, no ads, square bound. It's just 80 pages of absolute Millertude, all from the mens et manus of Miller, written and drawn by Frank Miller himself, with colors by Miller's frequent collaborator in comics and in life, Lynn Varley, and letters by the legendary letterer Todd Klein. Now, The Dark Knight Strikes Again is, of course, the long-awaited, desired by some, dreaded by others, sequel to Miller's mid-'80s masterpiece, The Dark Knight Returns. I can say for myself, personally, I fell more into the latter camp there, i.e. dread rather than desire. As I had just, actually, believe it or not, read The Dark Knight Returns for the first time earlier that same year, in 2001. It was while it was in the spring of 2001. I was out in Colorado on a concert tour with the Penn State Glee Club. For more details on that, go back and listen to Murd's Time Bubble, The 20th Time, which is all about my experiences on that concert tour and a few of the comics I bought while I was out west. But while I was on the tour bus, one of the things that I read to pass the time as we were driving through the Colorado desert was the starkly different gritty urban tale of The Dark Knight Returns. And on my first exposure, I was 22 years old, and I've never been as impressed with Miller's work as some others are. But even so, reading that story, I had to give Miller credit for the significant work of late 20th century graphic art he had produced. I appreciated what he was doing in terms of social satire. I think and I still think, actually, that that story worked a little better on that level than it ever did as a Batman story, although your mileage may, of course, vary. But even so, I acknowledged that this was a comic that was more or less worthy of its position in the canon of comics classics. And I did not much relish the notion of Miller attempting to produce a sequel to something like this. It was kind of the comic equivalent of trying to do like a Citizen Kane 2. But all the same, I lined up and was prepared in the latter part of 2001 to lay down my $7.95, which back then was kind of a lot to pay, even for an 80-page perfect-bound comic with no ads, for the first issue of this thing. But in the interest of equal time, I do want to relate one example of a person who was very excited about this release, a person with whom I've always associated The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and a person whom I probably otherwise would have forgotten about entirely. He was a guy who used to hang out at what was then my local comic shop, the Comic Swap in State College. I really only ran into him there once or twice. He wasn't one of the regulars. For Wednesday afternoons. There was a small circle of other guys that I saw a little bit more often and hung out with, but one occasion I do remember seeing him there was either the week this thing was released or the week just before. He had a beard and long, stringy hair, and he called himself Constantine. I'm pretty sure that wasn't his actual name, but he seemed like the kind of person who, when going away to college, decides to construct a new identity for himself, adopts a name not his own, and tries to, shed whatever stigmata he may have had in high school and start afresh. It kind of struck me that that's what he was doing. I don't think his name actually was Constantine, and feeding that theory is the fact that he affected a rumpled tan trench coat like that worn by John Constantine of the comics, and he carried a silver metal lighter engraved with the words F communism, just like the one carried by Jesse Custer of Preacher in the comics. He was kind of a Vertigo fanboy, in other words, or at least a fan of the edgier, grittier Vertigo titles at the time. And he was also a big Miller fan, apparently, because whenever I think of The Dark Knight Strikes Again and those people who were very excited for it, and who may or may not have been ultimately disappointed by it, I never really saw Constantine again after the event I'm about to describe here, so I don't know what his reaction to the first issue and subsequent issues was, but that day he was doing a little happy dance right there in the middle of the comic swap, just talking to me and a couple of other guys who were hanging out nearby, and to express his delight that this thing was coming out, and saying, "Oh, it's Miller Day, I'm gonna put this." And I remember my reaction was basically just to stand there playing it cool and sniffing and saying, because I felt incapable of sharing his excitement, and saying, yeah, that's gonna be me in 2003 when JLA Avengers comes out, because that project had just been announced in late 2001. I think. And it took Music and Perez a while to get it together. But I was just telling him, okay, I'm glad that you're excited about this Frank Miller thing that I'm not sure should have been made, but I'll be experiencing your level of excitement in a couple of years, so I can sort of relate. So there we are. Constantine was all about this Dark Knight Strikes Again miniseries. I was leery. And history kind of took its course from there. One more personal note before I actually start talking about the comic itself. This comic was one of the last that I purchased at the comic swap as a Penn State student. I always associate it with the end of my time at Penn State. In the fall of 2001, as I've mentioned a few times before on this podcast, was my ninth and final semester as a college student. And I do remember it being one of the last comics I brought home before finishing my college education and moving out of town and going home to Berks County. I kind of remembered it as being like something like late November, but having looked it up online now and then finding the actual release date, I was even more right than I realized. The release date for The Dark Knight Strikes Again #1 was actually December 5th of 2001. And back in those days when I was a Penn State student, the first week of December was just about always finals week. So that means that this is one of the very last comics that I bought in State College before graduating and skipping town. I mean, I kind of think, if I'm thinking back on it now, I do remember taking one of my last final exams, if not my very last final exam at Penn State, and then trudging downtown, stopping at a couple of shops to maybe buy a couple of Christmas presents for family members on the way, and ending up at the comic swap to buy some comics. And I guess this comic, this first issue of this Dark Knight sequel, might have been one of that armful of comics that I bought there. No, it's not one of the last comics I bought at the comic swap altogether. I went back several times after I graduated, so... But still, it's always stood up large in my mind. I always remember the first issue of this miniseries, maybe not even so much for what actually happened between the covers, as because it is a comics chronological correlative to such an important milestone in my personal life, i.e. the end of my college education, my graduation, and my moving on to the challenges of adulthood. And facing the challenges of later stages of life is kind of what the Dark Knight reality is all about, as perhaps we shall see here, as I begin finally discussing what goes on in this comic. All right. So, yes, The Dark Knight Strikes Again. On the very first page, we're told... we see Batman kind of in larger-than-life silhouette. It's an extreme close-up of his two eyes with a bunch of other panels superimposed over it. And that's kind of the view we get of Batman in general throughout this entire first issue. He's kind of lurking on the periphery, just skulking around in the shadows and the gutters of the various pages of the issue, like Batman does, But he's kind of haunting this first issue. We get a lot of his first-person narration. He has some dialogue from off-panel with some other characters, and he's not actually shown full body on panel. We get some extreme close-ups of different parts of his body, like his face on the first page, his hands elsewhere, but we don't really get the full Bat-Monty, as it were, until the climax of this first issue. He doesn't enter his own narrative here until the end of the first issue, which is somewhat significant, because Batman is a little bit decentered in this story because its focus is different from what it was in The Dark Knight Returns. I like to say that The Dark Knight Strikes Again is less DKR than DCU, because it shows Batman's focus, and Miller's, broadening a bit beyond the well-known futuristic urban hellscape of Gotham City, and focusing on the world instead. So Batman, on this first page of this issue, just to further my point here, he rumbles at us, It's been 3 years since, in the eyes of those who live above, I died. I've been very patient. I've trained my students and honed my skills. I've waited and watched the world go right straight to hell. So there you are. Batman's not just focused on cleaning up his city anymore. He's up against more than just a few mutant street gang members. Now his target is the globe. He's looking at the problems that have infected the entire world, which are different from the basic 1980s topical urban blight kind of things. He's focused on the world. He's broadened his range, and it's kind of broken both him and, you might say, Miller himself out of his funk and opened the door to admit a little bit of camp, because the tone in this series is considerably different, I think, from the first one. It doesn't take itself quite as seriously in both the writing and the art style that Miller is employing here. It's bigger and splashier and at times sillier. I mean, there are some moments of humor to be found in The Dark Knight Returns also, but that's taken several steps further in The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And there are bits that can very easily be argued are examples of camp. I'm standing by that. Even the color palette used by Lynn Varley, it's considerably brighter, and in some spots it almost kind of looks psychedelic. Yeah, you could say that this series, even more so than the original, is focusing on the full range of the DC Comics universe and the many colorful characters and ideas that inhabit it, and particularly its Silver Age heritage, and Miller kind of riffing on those ideas from the Silver Age and the idea of the Silver Age, and just how very far away that the Silver Age and its characters and ideas have become by 2001, let alone 1986. But anyway, I digress. So yes, the story opens with Batman more or less apropos of nothing, just kind of deciding, okay, it's been 3 years, the world's gone to hell, it's time to get out there and save the world. We're never really told exactly what set him off here. It seems that he just kind of, if you'll pardon the expression, arbitrarily decides it's time, the story begins now, so time to set events in motion. And so we just kind of start rolling from there. The rest of the issue is largely unprecipitated action involving Batman taking those steps he deems necessary to save the world from that which has polluted and profaned it. And this first issue is it's largely a setting up the chessboard kind of thing. It's really less about plot at first than it is about establishing the various characters and also the setting, what this Dark Knight dystopia of Miller's has come to in the 3 years story time that have passed since The Dark Knight Returns, and also just Miller showing off his style here. It's, as I said before, this is as much DCU as DKR, and it's kind of Miller's chance to give the DKR treatment to much of the rest of the classic DC stable, to give them a place and a role in his dystopia, and that's much of what we get in this first issue. Like I said, Batman is sidelined until the climactic scene of this first issue. He just kind of hangs around in the margins and allows Miller to cast the spotlight, or the bat signal if you'd rather, on a variety of other DC characters. And so it's most of the plot of the first issue is a recruitment narrative. It's getting the band back together. It's Batman sending out his chief lieutenant to recruit new soldiers to his cause, and it's also the opposition mustering its own forces against him once it becomes aware of his activities. And yeah, that opposition has got some DC Universe cachet to it as well. But okay, I might as well start here with the aforementioned chief lieutenant of Batman, and that is, of course, Carrie Kelly, who is the female Robin that was introduced in Dark Knight Returns. Carrie, whose full name, incidentally, is Carolyn Keene Kelly. If you don't know, Carolyn Keene is the pseudonym used by a series of writers who have written the adventures of Nancy Drew Girl Detective over the decades. So that should give you an idea of where Miller's head was at as far as developing Carrie's character. That turns out to be her full name. So yes, last time we saw her, she was Robin, with the pixie boots and the slingshot and all. But now, in the 3 years since DKR, she has adopted the idea of Catgirl. And have to say, in this reader's opinion, it's not much of a step forward developmentally. For one thing, she looks much more ridiculous in her new outfit than she did in the Robin suit with the green goggles and the slingshot and what have you. She looks like she's wearing leopard pajamas with a cowl with these gigantic fuzzy ears that are almost the size of her head, and those gigantic sneakers. Oh, my Lord, those damn sneakers, which she refers to as Chucks. And yes, don't get me wrong, I understand the reference. I know what Chuck Taylors are, but the fact that she refers to them as that, and she doesn't just call them that, she speaks to them and addresses them as Chucks, because apparently they have an onboard AI program and all kinds of fancy weaponry. They're utility sneakers, basically. And she gives them these ridiculous instructions like, and this is an actual example from the text, Chucks, but first it, peel, which basically means sprout wheels and roll backwards really quickly. It's... Yeah, the futuristic teen speak that she occasionally spouts is painful to hear. I mean, and it makes some sense for some characters. I mean, this is something that Miller did in The Dark Knight Returns also, with the mutant gang members. The two of them were kind of like a Greek chorus, the events going on, just pattering back and forth, describing what's going on, with Batman battling the mutant gang leader, etc., etc. And a couple of those mutant gang members have now come into Batman's employ as his foot soldiers. Training under Carrie Kelly, actually. She calls them Bat Boys, and they don't like it when she does that. So it makes some sense for them to be spouting this Anthony Burgess-inspired futuristic teen lingo, which apparently Miller developed, with the help of his wife and colorist Lynn Varley, so he doesn't get all the blame here. But it makes some sense for those characters, but out of a more intelligent character like Carrie, who should probably know better and should speak better English, just to hear her shouting these ridiculous code phrases at her shoes, it's enough to take most people out of the story, I would have to think. It's certainly inspired a pretty intense roll of the eyes from me. So yeah, that didn't help. The Savannah Cat pajamas she's wearing didn't help either. And the characterization, beyond just the way she looks and the silly catchphrases she sometimes shouts out, it's a little uneven. She's a strong character, but she's not as strong or as consistently strong as perhaps she should be. She kind of wavers between the poles of tempered steel field commander to the Bat Boys and jelly-legged gibbering fangirl as she's confronted with certain heroic icons that Batman recruits to his cause. And, she doesn't know quite how to act. She kind of gets the squeeze a little bit. Then there's a couple of scenes where she kind of collapses and when she's forced to make some difficult command decisions and it's a little too much for her. And that's fine. I mean, it's okay. She's just a teenage girl after all. It's all right for her to display moments of emotionality, but the fangirl stuff was a little off. And also there's Batman's attitude towards her, which can be interpreted in a couple of ways. I'm pretty sure Miller intended it to be a paternal relationship, but maybe he also threw some things in there that lends itself to alternate interpretations. Batman's constant paternal petting of Carrie is... it's certainly not sexual, but it's still creepy. And and that's aggravated by the fact that she's wearing this silly cat suit, as in Selina Kyle, as in Catwoman. I mean, can this be taken as a sign intended by Miller or not that Bruce is grooming Carrie to be more than a crime-fighting partner? Or worse yet, I mean, we're not really told in the first issue why she decided to switch from Robin to Catgirl and where this costume came from. Maybe it's mentioned in issue 2 or 3. I'm sorry, I didn't reread those for the purposes of this episode, but... I don't know if it's eventually explained why she decided to adopt this catsuit, but just the thought that perhaps Bruce gave her the suit, and worse, possibly gaslit her into believing that it was her own idea. It's a little off. I think I would have rather see Carrie remain Robin for the events of this series, or become a Batwoman or a Huntress or something. But yeah, the Catgirl thing, it was equal parts ridiculous and skeevy. But whatever we may think of Carrie's wardrobe choices, she does acquit herself well, carrying out the orders of her general, i.e. to go throughout the landscape of this nightmarish future DC universe, United States, and find some of Batman's fallen comrades and recruit them to Batman's cause. So we get to see Frank Miller do his little riffs on characters such as Ray Palmer, who has been captured and imprisoned by the enemy in a really unique and interesting way. It's kind of a fun little reversal misdirection, because he appears to be in some alien landscape where it's always dark and cold, and there's this endless ocean full of nightmarish sea beasts. And the true nature of his imprisonment is it's a cool story idea, and I'm not going to even say what it is here. But that's the first of the old school Justice League allies of Batman that Carrie goes to retrieve, and she does a pretty good job of it. And later on, she also goes and rescues Barry Allen, who's in a different kind of ironic punishment. He has been basically shut up inside a gigantic hamster wheel in a power plant somewhere in Middle America, and he is forced to just run at superhuman speeds nonstop for probably in a couple decades by the time Carrie gets to him. He's forced to play ball because the opposition, the nature of which I will be getting to in a minute, don't worry, I'm not going to just keep on referring to them as the opposition, but they captured Barry, forced him to act as a human dynamo, basically, to meet the vampiric energy needs of the United States, and most particularly American industry, on threat of something terrible being done to his love, Iris West, who's being held captive. But when Carrie comes and breaks him out of the dynamo in which he was imprisoned, she tells him first thing, Iris, we have her, we rescued her, she's fine, you're free now, you don't have to be a slave to these people anymore. And so, yes, so we learn that Barry Allen has basically been producing cheap energy for most of the American people, and yes, American big business for a couple of decades now. But now he's been released, and Carrie presents him with a new, updated Flash costume, which includes, ye gods, gigantic sneakers. What the hell is it with the footwear fetish from Frank Miller in 2001? At least Barry has the decency to resent his updated runner's togs. He makes some crack about how kids today can't tell the difference between just plain old and classic. So at least he thinks his new costume is ugly. And beyond that, he's just as crew-cut and cornball as Barry Allen always has been. So Miller is not... he's actually not doing too badly with his takes on some of these classic characters. And I'm particularly impressed with his take on the Question, who also appears a couple of times in this first issue. He doesn't officially join Batman's band just yet. He's still a loose cannon free agent. But, Miller's take on the Question, Vic Sage, is kind of note-perfect, I've got to say. He basically takes Alan Moore's paranoid delusional Rorschach, who is based on the character of the Question, and takes Moore's interpretation and feeds it back through the Silver Age Ditko original by way of Sin City. Yeah, he's a paranoid fringe journalist, and his voice is kind of that of the gonzo investigative journalist, and he's a perfect fit for the world of Dark Knight Strikes Again. Yes, and it also feeds back into kind of a broader theme of the role of journalism and media in society, which was an interest of Miller's in 1986, and that's still so now. So let's see, other characters. So Ray Palmer is also present. He's every bit the two-fisted scientist he always was. His years of imprisonment in that cold, dark, watery hellscape doesn't really seem to take much of a toll on him. He's back on his feet and ready for action almost as soon as he's gotten out of there and had a good night's sleep and a shower. There's a new Green Lantern introduced in this story on like one page. His name is Wilfredo Mendoza, and inspired by the rising public awareness of the Batman's, the fact that Batman is alive, for one thing, and the fact that Batman is on the move and recruiting and making moves to bring down the establishment. This Wilfredo Mendoza kid decides he's going to be active as Green Lantern, but once captured, it's discovered that his power ring is just a Spencer's Gifts novelty that produces a harmless light show. So, not a very impressive treatment of the Green Lantern mantle in this first issue, anyway. But you might see it as Miller's take on legacy heroes, especially as a vehicle for diversity representation. But also, it's his way of an indicator of how much certain people miss heroes in this world, how ready the world of The Dark Knight Strikes Again is for a return by not just Batman, but a bunch of heroes. And yeah, even Oliver Queen is back in action in this story. We don't see him until near the very end, but he was present in The Dark Knight Returns, too. You may remember he was missing an arm, and he was kind of sloppy and grouchy and, well, understandably bitter about how life has treated him. But he's a lot happier now. He's sporting a brand spanking new cybernetic arm. He's cleaned and trimmed, and he's wearing what looks like a wrestler's singlet, and he's humming "I've Got the World on a String" to himself as he knocks an arrow and prepares to shoot a payload of kryptonite napalm at guess who. So we might as well use that as a segue, because there are a few other power players in this story, but on the opposite end of the metaphorical chessboard, because Batman was able to recruit a few of his old allies, but a few of them that had not been imprisoned or enslaved in the ways I've described for Barry Allen and Ray Palmer have been enslaved in other ways by the opposition. And those are the ones that are probably the most powerful and the most iconic, and who maybe stand at the most obvious remove from ordinary humanity. And those are, of course, Superman, since the Batman-Superman friendship, rivalry, opposition was a major part of the last act of The Dark Knight Returns, obviously, when there was that big battle between Batman and Superman, in which Batman faked his own death and went underground. Here we have Superman back again. I'll put him off for last, since it's kind of a sticking point with me. But in addition to Superman, the opposition has gotten Wonder Woman in its corner, and similar to what they did with Barry, and keeping him in line by capturing Iris West. All of these characters that are being used as the dog soldiers of the opposition are being kept in line by exploiting their human connections, their loves, things that Batman ostensibly lacks, especially at this late stage in his life. But Wonder Woman is there, and Miller's redesign of her kind of looks like it's as much WWF as it is Wonder Woman. She kind of looks like she's wearing a boxing outfit. She looks like she'd be comfortable in one of Miller's other, more martially oriented, grittier and noir-inspired works, like 300 or Sin City. And so her Amazon sisters are being threatened by the opposition. And Captain Marvel is also present. And he's aged into kind of a corny old geezer with a hairstyle that looks like Commissioner Dolan from Will Eisner's The Spirit. He's just kind of the sort of corny old land sakes, Pa Kent-style geezer that you'd expect Captain Marvel to age into. When the opposition holds the continued well-being of his sister Mary over his head, apparently they're holding her captive, the worst thing he can think of to say is, "You bum." That's our squeaky clean captain. And that's not even the coolest part of Miller's take on the good captain. And the one thing I do remember about the later issues of this miniseries is that we learn about the nature of Captain Marvel's existence here in this future world. And that's another thing I'm not going to spoil. So those two are like the chief agents of the opposition, plus, of course, a certain Man of Steel. Now, on the few occasions I can recall discussing The Dark Knight Strikes Again on the Comic Geek Speak podcast proper, I can remember kind of shutting down on the mic when we started talking about this and just kind of sulkily saying something along the lines of, "I don't like the way Frank Miller portrays Superman." And it's true. I'm really not fond of the way that he writes Superman between The Dark Knight Returns and this story. It's pretty clearly the point of view of a Batman fan, and it's always reminded me a little bit of like a kid on a playground arguing with a classmate over whether Batman could beat up Superman. And now here he is making comics and controlling the outcome. The portrayal of Superman has not been my favorite aspect of Miller's DC work. And the way he handles the character in The Dark Knight Strikes Again is, in a way, a little better than what he did, in my opinion, than what he did in The Dark Knight Returns, but in a couple of other ways, a little worse. And better and worse are, of course, always relative terms. Now, I'm talking about from the point of view of a Superman fan who doesn't really like to see the character run down. And that let's face it, that is what Miller is doing here. I mean, Superman in The Dark Knight Returns, he was kind of portrayed as this deluded, authoritarian, establishmentarian stooge, just blind to the possibility of social betterment and just convinced unflappably with this true belief in his own rightness and the rightness of his actions and the rightness of the position of those in authority who were pulling his strings, and very much a defender of the status quo. And it all in all, not a very flattering portrayal of the Man of Steel, but still somewhat heroic. But here in The Dark Knight Strikes Again, he's still at least operating as a hero within certain closely set parameters or bounds set for him by those who currently hold his dog leash, i.e. the mysterious opposition. Who really aren't mysterious in the story. I'm just kind of putting off talking about who and what they really are. It's Lex Luthor. Let's put it that way. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But anyway, so now we have a Superman who's still active as a hero, and he's still preserving the status quo, but there's a definite edge of desperation. Well, more than an edge of desperation, just a pit of desperation in which he's stuck as we get him kind of monologizing to himself about, and mostly uttering imprecations against Bruce Wayne. Bruce, you maniac, you deluded fool, look what you're doing. And Batman actually responds a little bit. Not that they can actually hear each other, but it's kind of like parallel internal monologues about the two of them talking about each other, criticizing one another inwardly. You can understand that this is a friendship that has gone sour. They're talking about each other in terms that are recognizable as the kind of things that ex-friends, especially ex-friends in positions of power, would be saying about one another. Ex-friends who are battling for the fate and the soul of the world. And Superman, you can tell, is kind of trapped in a state of denial, where he's convincing himself he's still able to do good in the world, but all the time he's very well aware that he's just the puppet of evil forces that Batman always knew he was, except now Superman himself is aware of how ethically indefensible those he serves happen to be. But he's managing to project his frustration, his consternation, his fear on Batman instead of against the real enemy here, who's pulling his strings. And as it turns out, they have control, the leverage they have on Superman. They had Iris West in captivity. They had Mary Marvel in captivity. They're threatening Wonder Woman's Amazon sisters. With Superman, it's not Lois, but it's the bottle city of Kandor, with his cousin Kara trapped inside. And his oppressors, the opposition, they actually do murder a Kryptonian family right in front of Superman's eyes to ensure that he plays ball. And this is kind of his punishment for calling an unsanctioned meeting of his fellow Luthor lieutenants, Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, on the old Justice League satellite to discuss the situation, the fact that Batman is back and the fact that they can't go on like they've been doing. But the opposition then shows up and sends Superman directly to confront Batman, and that catapults us right into the climactic sequence of this first issue, which is Superman invading the Batcave and having a big fight against not just Batman, but everybody that Batman has recruited. Even in one of my favorite scenes of the whole thing, Batman toys, literally and figuratively, with Superman first by sending his robot dinosaur in the Batcave up against Superman, and then dispatching a robot Bizarro. So this is Miller's take on the good old Silver Age pre-crisis Bizarro, wearing a crude stone medallion around his chest, around his neck that says Bizarro number 12, and then saying something like, "Ha! Hello, goodbye, Superman. Me love you so much, we want to make you die a painful, horrible death." I'm pretty choosy in my Bizarro presentations, but this is a good Bizarro. A good, silly Silver Age Bizarro. He's on page for one One page, Superman punches him in the neck, and his head does a rock'em sock'em robot thing. It pops out on a spring, and he just squeals with delight. And Superman just says something like, "This is a new low even for you, Bruce." But then Bruce dispatches Barry Allen and Ollie Queen and so on to tenderize Superman a little. And Oliver douses him with kryptonite napalm from the head of one of his arrows. And then Batman finally appears on page to deliver the killing blows. So here at the end of the first issue of The Dark Knight Strikes Again, Miller is already attempting to top the climax of The Dark Knight Returns by having a rematch between Batman and Superman, and this time it's shown to be absolutely no contest. It's really kind of humiliating for Superman and devaluing to the character, and this again is what I'm talking about, where Miller is not really... He's at least giving us that Superman is doing what he's doing under duress, and that he understands on some level the wrongness of his actions, and at least he's not an unwitting stooge this time. But still, Miller's not exactly being fair to the character, and there's one scene one panel in the middle of this battle in the Batcave where Batman's voiceover says to Superman something like, "You never all those high and mighty powers, Superman." Now, here it is. "That's the problem with all those high and mighty powers. They made you cocky, overconfident. You never learned to think strategically. I did." And no, Miller, I'm sorry. Superman absolutely did learn to think strategically. If you read some of the Silver Age Superman stories, or Bronze Age, etc., any pre-crisis Superman story, pretty much, the writers were constantly giving Superman puzzles and riddles and difficult situations that couldn't be solved through simple force majeure. And he wasn't just throwing overwhelming, planet-shattering force at every problem he went up against. He very often needed to think and rationalize and deduce. I mean, that's what all that scientific equipment in his Fortress of Solitude was about. I mean, back in the days of Elliot Magan and Cary Bates, Superman was always thinking strategically. He wasn't just throwing strength and heat vision at everything. That's one reason, I think, why the pre-crisis Superman and Batman got along as well as they did, because they could relate on that level. So don't tell me that Superman doesn't think strategically. That's a critical misunderstanding of the character. But anyway, Superman in this Miller-verse was defeated by Batman, and that's the end of the first issue. Miller has already replicated the climax and exceeded it from his first miniseries, and so that tells you how far over the top he's planning to go with the brewing conflict for this second miniseries, and it leaves the reader wondering, gee, where is he going to go from here? Batman's already beaten Superman. What next? All right. Okay, so going from plot, like I said, this first issue is mainly set up. Things escalate from there, although, once again, I haven't reread issues 2 and 3 for a while, so I don't know exactly where it goes after this. But turning for a minute to the level of theme, which is, for works like this, in a way even more important than the plot anyway. So... on the level of socio-political commentary, which I mentioned before is one of the things that impressed me the most about The Dark Knight Returns, this story is set 3 years after The Dark Knight Returns, but obviously it was published 15 years after it, and therefore it reflects a 15-year shift in socio-political concerns and timeliness. So Miller goes back to... I mentioned earlier the role of journalism in the media, and that was a concern of Miller's the first time around, and it still is this time. He deals with in The Dark Knight Returns, we were confronted with a lot of talking heads, and it was a lot of hyper-mediated monitor mania going on in the artwork. A lot of panels of talking heads spewing various perspectives on the events and concerns of the day. And he seems to be looking at the meretriciousness of media specifically. Like, for example, we've still got the same assortment of talking heads, but they're saying slightly different things. And... it's all just the same general ideas, but bigger and trashier. Like, for example, we've got things like news in the nude, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a naked lady that's spouting, the news stories with a certain definite partisan slant. yeah, there's kind of a lot of that in here. Like there's a lot of Fox News fair and balanced type stuff, and we've got Jimmy Olsen thrown in here, interestingly, as the kind of the lone voice of journalistic conscience and integrity. But because he has to scream so loud to be heard over all of the crap, he ironically ends up sounding like a raving partisan loon himself, just in the other direction. And beyond that. So that's one theme that's preserved here. And the other overarching thing is that Miller seems to have changed his focus as far as what the largest societal ill might be. He seems to have gone from Reaganite politics to... He seems to have accepted at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. We've passed, since 1986, we've passed through the numb prosperity and slacker cynicism of the 90s to the early 2000s and the rise of neoconservatism. But he seems to be of the opinion that the greatest threats to the nation and world as of that time were corporate in nature. And, it's bearing in mind here, this was published in December of 2001, just 2 months after 9/11. So just imagine how different this story's narrative might have been if Miller had started work on it just a couple of years later. One answer to that question might be to just look at the Holy Terror story that Miller did a couple of years after this, in the mid-2000s, which started out as a Batman story, Batman versus Al-Qaeda, very much rooted in Miller's own personal feelings of rage and anger against the events of 9/11 and those who perpetrated it. Which started out as a Batman story, as I said, but somewhere along the line, Miller and DC kind of mutually decided that the story... It was in the best interest of everyone if the story went forward without Batman as a character in it. So Miller just used a Batman analog and took the story to another publisher. And it came out and it was kind of panned as being Islamophobic. And even Miller is a little sorry that he wrote the thing with the kind of extreme and angry attitude that he used for it. So there is a possibility that if this Dark Knight Strikes Again thing had been written a little bit later, it might have borne a few more similarities to that. He might have... chosen a different focus than corporate entities for Batman's ire in The Dark Knight Strikes Again. But as it is, the big bads here, the opposition I've been referencing repeatedly, is basically corporate conspiracies with none other than Lex Luthor at its head. We've moved past senile old Ronnie Reagan with his jelly beans and his finger on the Star Wars button here. The president of this reality, just 3 years after The Dark Knight Returns, apparently Ronnie has either retired from politics or died or something, because the president now is one Rick Rickard, which is a great dual reference, really, because it references both DC history and broader popular culture and ties it in with Miller's theme of the inefficacy of American politics. Because Rick Rickard, it's a play on both Prez Rickard, i.e. The teen president of early 70s Joe Simon and Jerry Grandinetti fame. It's a campy favorite of mine. I've talked many times about how I love Prez, and his last name was Rickard, and the president of the U.S. in The Dark Knight Strikes Again is also named Rickard. And it's also kind of a play on Rick Deckard, who is the central character of Blade Runner, based on Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is all about simulacra and the differences between humanity and simulacra thereof, between the replicant and the real. And sure enough, true to that theme, President Rick Rickard turns out to be nothing more than a telegenic CGI effect programmed by the wicked industrialists who really run things in this future to keep things in line. He's just a good optic to reassure the masses and nothing more. And at one point in the story, everyone becomes aware of that when the president develops a programming glitch. And of course, it's Jimmy Olsen who is able to scream to the masses, the president is a hologram. So that's a great detail. So, yeah, Miller is a little bit cynical about politics and those. He's convinced that evil corporations are really behind everything, and that is represented, of course, by Lex Luthor, long-standing DC Universe antagonist. And Miller's take on Lex is pretty clearly descended from the post-crisis take on the character. It's not so much the renegade mad scientist of the Silver and Bronze Ages, who's such a favorite character of mine. No, it's more the robber baron Lex Luthor. right after that incident with Rick Deckard glitching on national television, that's when we first see Luthor, the power behind the throne, as it were, beating the living tar out of the scientist who's in charge of maintaining the president's program. And this Luthor is... he's not only post-crisis inspired, he's also Wilson Fisk inspired. You know, he looks and acts a lot like the Kingpin. He's big and bulky and brutish. He's a huge man, which is something that Lex Luthor never really was in any other like mainstream DCU representation. He's always muscular, but never quite as physically massive as Miller likes to draw him in this miniseries. And we don't really get that much about Luthor as a character in this first issue. He's more like an elemental force, like a personification of the hostile environment in which the story takes place. He's like a satanic entity, almost. As standing in, as I've hinted multiple times, as he's less a character than he is a personification of the baleful corporate forces that seem to be singled out as the major ill of the world in Miller's future dystopia here. And not only do we have Luthor here as the opposition, but we've also got a very timely new take on the classic Brainiac and Luthor team. And it really does make sense in this sort of dystopia that of course, heartless exploitative big business, as represented by Luthor, would be hand-in-hand with the worst of personified or fetishized technology, as represented by Brainiac. You remember those little transistor things that used to stud Brainiac's head? By this nightmare future, those little transistors have spread from Brainiac's chrome dome all over his body, like massive tattoos or piercings, or like a creeping venereal rash of some kind. In any case, they're a great visualization of creeping decadence in an already horribly amoral being. So he shows up at one point. He's the one who actually destroys those Kryptonians in the bottle city of Kandor as a way of punishing Superman for his whatever rebellious thoughts he may have had. He calls Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel together for an unauthorized meeting, and his punishment is... Luthor and Brainiac both show up in these 100-foot-tall holographic projections, which the heroes are able to see from the satellite windows in space. And Brainiac, at that point, kills a few innocent Kandor residents. Just another Kryptonian bloodline snuffed out for all time. It's kind of a powerful moment, and that's when we see just who and what is really in charge in this future world. Just who and what is controlling these once great and proud iconic heroes, and just who and what Batman is out to defeat, semi-symbolically, in the course of this work of socio-political satire, which is also a superhero action story. So, bottom line, I have somewhat often disparaged The Dark Knight Strikes Again, even if it's only to just kind of fold my arms and sulk and say, I don't like how Miller writes Superman. But now that I've come back to the story and reread it, or at least reread the first issue, like 4 or 5 times in preparation for the recording of this episode of The Time Bubble, I'm finding that it's actually not quite as bad as I remembered, or not quite as bad as I wanted it to be over the years. But still, it's not that great either. If I'm being fair and balanced here, as it were. The Dark Knight, on the level of art, it doesn't hold a candle to The Dark Knight Returns. I think most commentators are agreed on that point, at least. The Dark Knight Returns had a definite aim and a statement. And Miller, when he came back to do the sequel, it feels to me like he didn't have quite as strong a purpose in writing it. Like he did it just because he could, and maybe to shut up a few people and to piss off a few other people along the way. And we know that Miller enjoys to do that. But yeah, maybe it's just the difference between the early 2000s and the mid-'80s. Maybe the work's not quite as strong. Maybe the work's not as interesting because the times were less interesting. The 80s were, after all, very interesting and inspiring times. But Miller just couldn't quite bring the same fire to what he was doing here, and as I said, I think he mainly just did it because he could, and the work shows it. So on the level of art, it leaves a good bit to be desired, but as just your basic superhero entertainment, it's not all that bad. Not great, but not bad. So, if you can remember reading this and being disappointed in it or outright hating it in 2001 and haven't come back to it since, I'd encourage you to do what I did and come back to it now with older eyes and see if maybe it has a little bit more to offer than you remembered it having. And if you, like me, are not that big a fan of Miller's take on various things, in particular The Man of Steel, I actually have a thought here that may prove helpful to you. It's kind of a... It's a Puck apology, similar to it's a Puck, the Midsummer Night's Dream suggestion. If these shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. Consider this. Here's an internet-worthy theory about this whole Dark Knight reality. Maybe this whole reality... Maybe it's less about Miller's take on Batman and Superman and the DC Universe and so forth. Maybe it's not so much that as it is Miller's take on Batman's take on himself and Superman and the rest. Maybe Batman is a grossly unreliable narrator in all these events, and maybe they didn't play out anywhere near the way Batman is recalling them. In fact, just to take things a few steps further, what if this whole Dark Knight Returns, Strikes Back, etc. reality is just a huge, elaborate hallucination playing out in the mind of a senile Bruce Wayne as he sits in his wheelchair in some exclusive, expensive, posh retirement home somewhere in the countryside, staring, playing out behind his eyes as he stares out across rolling country vistas and is seeing nothing but exaggerated visions of his earlier glories as an urban vigilante. Oh, and also he has a mustache, just to complete the picture for you. Just imagine Bruce Wayne as we see him at the beginning of The Dark Knight Returns when he's a hot rod race car driver. Another thing that it's pretty easy to believe is just like a macho fantasy contrived by Bruce Wayne's aging mind. Just imagine how he looked when he takes off that race car helmet with that mustache. Imagine that Bruce Wayne sitting in a wheelchair in a rest home somewhere, fantasizing everything that happens in the pages that follow in The Dark Knight Returns and this miniseries. If you don't care for Miller's take on things, of his take on Batman or Superman, etc., you can always just imagine that it's all just playing out in an old man's mind. So the story's actually a little more interesting, I think, when you consider it in that respect. It's a new wrinkle, a new angle to consider. Maybe the whole thing can be, whether it's a hallucination or not, you can think about this as the Dark Knight reality, or Earth 31, as it's later been designated by DC Comics. It made money, so of course it has to have an Earth in whatever multiversal topography DC's put together lately. Just consider it as... you can think of it as a study of the delusions, the distortions, and the extreme conservative thinking that can seize upon the aging masculine mind. Just think of it as a work of gerontological fiction. Whether Miller intended it that way or not, Miller likes to shock people. He likes to have his own interpretation of things. So we can certainly have our own interpretation of the works that he has produced. And if The Dark Knight Strikes Again or The Dark Knight Returns don't suit you, think of it that way. Oh, and one last note in parting about the lettering work of Todd Klein in this miniseries. Not the best of his storied career. He does a pretty good job of replicating the style that John Costanza used in lettering the 1986 original, which is probably what he was going for. But there are a few points in the story where the lettering could have gone a long way to making the story a bit clearer to the reader. Like there's a few places where there are conversations taking place in the form of dialogue captions between characters that are not actually shown on page. And the captions look exactly the same from one speaker to the other. There's a little more he could have done with different colors of captions or different font styles that would have made things a little bit clearer. But he was going for the stark 80s approach, so I guess we'll give him a pass there. Kind of an odd little quibble on which to end my review of this thing, so let me just go back and state one more time. If you haven't tried The Dark Knight Strikes Again since it first came out in 2001, especially if you didn't like it the first time around, give it another try. You may be surprised at what you find. Well, that's a hell of a lot more than I ever thought I'd have to say about The Dark Knight Strikes Again in 2001. So let's just move on from there, shall we? Okay, the second selection of this edition of the Time Bubble. Let's stay in the Gotham City vicinity, I think. Let's shift back in time to what was then the present-day DC Universe. And go from one of the last important Bat comics of 2001 to the very first Batman comic, I have it on good authority, to be released in 2002. Cover date of March 2002. It was released on, I think, January 3rd. And it was an important tone setter for the majority of the rest of the Batman storytelling that would take place in that year. I'm talking here about Batman the 10-Cent Adventure, which came out from the creative team of Greg Rucka, Rick Burkett, and Klaus Janson, all underneath a very striking black, white, and red cover by Staz Johnson, showing Bruce Wayne caught in a police searchlight and casting a bat silhouette behind himself. Now, this is your basic 32-page comic with ads, and it was kind of an interesting experimental stride forward in terms of comics, not only storytelling, but comics promotion, in that it was essentially a promotional giveaway, with that 10-cent cover price. It was a promotional giveaway without the giveaway part, of course. There is that nominal 10-cent fee, which helped to recoup a sliver of the comic's production cost, I guess. Although I know for a fact that a lot of comics retailers just went ahead and gave the comic away, either to certain of its subscribers or even to everybody. Just ate that $10 cost, that 10-cent cost. If it had been published just a little bit later on, certainly if it had been published today, it would have been a free comic book day release. If it had been published, but it was published a mere few months before the very first Free Comic Book Day, which happened in 2002. But for the first couple of years, I'm pretty sure I remember that most Free Comic Book Day releases were basically just reprints. It wasn't until a couple of years in that the publishers started to catch on to the idea that these free comic books were an ideal opportunity to promote and to get people hooked in or roped into certain upcoming publishing events that they had in mind for that year. Yeah, the 10-Cent Adventure of Batman came out just a few months before the first Free Comic Book Day and a couple of years before the full marketing potential of the Free Comic Book Day concept would be realized. This comic was possibly intended to draw in new readers in general, but also, very specifically, it was intended to drive an upcoming storyline that would take over the Batman titles, all of them, for the entire first half of the year 2002. So yeah, it's intended to be both a hook-in for readers and also a come-on, the cheap kind, in more senses than one, for the Bruce Wayne murderer, multi-part story. The 10-Cent Adventure led straight into the first part of that multi-part story, which would have been Detective Comics number 766, and the murderer story spilled over from there across 12 chapters, crossing over through 7 different titles, and that in turn led right into Bruce Wayne Fugitive, which was 20-plus parts long, including 6 Aftermath tie-ins, crossing over across a variety of different titles, all the Batman titles and the Batman family titles. Phew! This thing went on for half a year, people. It dominated the Batman corner of the DC Universe and the DC publishing line for the first 6 months of 2002. And it also helps explains why I basically took the whole first half of 2002 off from buying and reading Batman comics. So yeah, this little 10-cent come-on didn't exactly do its work on this reader and collector, but it must have for some. But anyway, as to what the comic itself actually does in terms of story. The first 4 pages, once again, this is a hook-in for readers new and old alike, so it takes the first 4 pages to retell Batman's origin yet again. So this is something that they just really love to do at DC, is tell us once over and over again who Batman is and how he came to be. But it's the different variations on the theme that are pleasing, just the balance of convention and invention. And so here we have Greg Rucka and artist, penciler Rick Burkett and inker Klaus Janson, giving us just a quick 4-page recap of Batman's, which is not that much longer, really, than the very first time Batman's origin story was told, particularly pages 2 and 3. It's a 2-page spread with a panel layout that's roughly Batman symbol shaped. So it's a pleasingly stylized rendition, and it doesn't take up too much time of Batman's origin. And Burkett's style really does help to make this umpteenth retelling of Batman's origin more palatable and enjoyable. He uses a style here that's kind of a cross between Lee Weeks and Darwin Cook, so you definitely take that as the compliment that it's meant to be. And once we get past that 4-page origin recap, the rest of the issue is kind of your basic A Night in the Life of Batman crawl. Seemingly intended to reestablish Batman's current/eternal status quo for both new and returning readers. And once again, current/eternal, that comes back to that balance between convention and invention that I just mentioned. The eternal status quo is Batman doing what Batman always more or less does, going out, haunting the rooftops of Gotham and battling criminals. So we do get a little bit of that. We see Batman fighting Russian mobsters. We see Batman rescuing people from a college dorm fire, rescuing everyone but one young man that he couldn't quite get to, and, in typical Bruce Wayne's fashion, fixating on and brooding over that one life he couldn't save rather than feeling positive about all the lives he did save. There's a scene towards the end where he retires to the Batcave at the end of a long night's crime fighting and just sits there staring at a constant loop of news footage of the fire and of the one life that he couldn't save. Yeah. So that's more or less convention. That's what's constant in Bruce Wayne's life and his routine running around fighting crime in Gotham night after night. But for the new reader, the current status quo of Batman, the things that people maybe have been away from Batman's corner of the DC universe for a while and that need to be caught up on, for writer Greg Rucka, this mostly means the involvement of Sasha Bordeaux, a character that Rucka created, and whom relatively few other DCU writers really bothered to, even writers of Batman stories bothered to acknowledge. But since Rucka's writing this story, she's right there in the thick of things. Sasha Bordeaux, I mentioned her in an earlier episode of the Time Bubble. She was Bruce Wayne's bodyguard. And she happened to stumble into the fact that after her employer mysteriously eluded her a few times, slipped away from her to put on the Batman costume and go do his thing, she managed to follow him and tumbled to the fact that he has this dual identity and this double life as a vigilante. And the two of them being, stubborn and adhering to professional or chivalric codes of various kinds, they basically trapped one another. And I think that's Rucka's turn of phrase, actually, that they trapped one another. So they were stuck with one another. Sasha refused to leave Batman's side, and Batman couldn't afford to have someone running around outside of his employ who knows his secret, so he was kind of forced to take Sasha Bordeaux on as a crime-fighting partner so that she could bodyguard him as Batman, just as she did when he was Bruce Wayne. So he ended up with kind of an unofficial, little-known and little-remembered costumed sidekick for a little time here during the Greg Rucka-written adventures of Batman. And she is in full costume and purple domino mask by Batman's side during his patrol in the events of this Batman the 10-Cent Adventure comic. And she is actually the narrator of the story, and she's the one who provides kind of an insider/outsider perspective on Bruce Wayne, his life, his psychological and emotional peculiarities. She describes his quest as an endless fool's errand, and that indeed is the title of this story, The Fool's Errand. Something that he goes out there time and time again to protect his city from the kind of pain that he suffered, knowing all the while that it's impossible and that he will fail time and time again, but he keeps on doing it and he keeps on punishing himself for the inevitable outcome. As I mentioned earlier about how he goes back to the Batcave and beats himself up over the young man he couldn't save from that fire. So Sasha gives us her running commentary on the Batman and his routine and his psyche. And at some point she mentions in passing that she has fallen in love with him, which was a little disappointing for me to read. I didn't realize that there was that kind of dynamic between Sasha and Bruce, though I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised by it. My reaction was basically just kind of, ew. And we also, speaking of timely material, stuff specific to this period of Bat history, we also get a little scene of where we're reintroduced to another one of Bruce's past love interests, Vesper Fairchild. And she's a character who was created by writer Doug Monk. She first appeared in Batman number 540, cover dated March of 1997. So Vesper Fairchild had been a part of Batman's world for exactly 5 years as of the publication of the 10-Cent Adventure. And I guess Rucka had set her up prior to this, that she'd kind of wandered back into Bruce Wayne's life after being gone for a while. She's described to us as a journalist. We see I think she was originally more like a radio talk jock. in Monk's original concept of her, but she's being described as a journalist here, so maybe she had a career change in the meantime. And we're told that Bruce Wayne was in love with her, and in typical Bruce Wayne fashion, when she got too close to him, drove her away. There is a scene where we actually see Batman sitting there on a rooftop using binoculars to spy on her through her window, and Sacha Bordeaux's narration tells us that Batman's been coming there a lot, and my reaction is, once again, ew. I don't really care that much for Bruce Wayne's stalker. I mean, if he's going to push these women away, he kind of has to commit to their not being a part of his life. You can't have it both ways. And this reintroduction of Vesper Fairchild, as it turns out, is it's not just to make us feel disappointed in Batman and Bruce Wayne for not being able to cut himself loose from these emotional ties effectively, or even trying to do so if he's not going to successfully do it. I mean, if you're going to keep on stalking her, just let her be a part of your life, you know? But anyway, the main reason that we're being introduced to Vesper Fairchild again is Fairchild again. I do know how to pronounce the word, trust me. Is in the way of foreshadowing, because we're about to be exposed to yet another example of girls in the refrigerator. Because by the end of this 10-cent issue, after that scene I mentioned where this night-long night in the life of Batman sequence has ended, and Sasha and Batman are back in the Batcave, and Batman has commenced beating himself up for that life he couldn't save. Then, at the very end of the issue, there's an unexpected turn when there's a bit of commotion up in the atrium, the entrance chamber of Wayne Manor, and when Sasha and Bruce go up to investigate, they find the dead body of Vesper Fairchild lying there on the floor. And so there we are. R.I.P. Vesper Fairchild. She was a part of the comics for exactly 5 years, and then sacrificed on the altar of narrative. And then the Gotham City Police very timely burst in and find Bruce cradling the dead and bloody body of his former love, Fairchild. And they're about to put him under arrest. So, and that's where we go from just reintroducing Batman and his changing yet changeless status quo to the readers, to leading us right into the upcoming Bruce Wayne Fugitive, massively multi-part crossover event. And that's we learn now why Bruce Wayne is a fugitive, because he's caught by the police cradling the murdered body of his ex-lover in his own house, and he is the prime suspect, and he has to go on the run from there. And doing what he does as a detective, cut off, I believe, from the resources of Bruce Wayne, to try and solve the mystery of who actually did this to his ex-love interest. And I feel foolish right now, which is hardly anything new for me, but let me apologize. I've actually been getting this backwards this whole time I've been recording this. It's actually the Bruce Wayne murderer ? That comes first and leads directly out of this 10-cent adventure. And Bruce Wayne fugitive statement, no punctuation, story that the larger story of the two, actually, that follows from the murderer arc. So that's the order. First the 10-cent adventure, then the shorter Bruce Wayne murderer story, and then the longer Bruce Wayne fugitive. Yes, my apologies for getting that backwards. So anyway, at this point, I think I'm just going to go ahead and spoil who's actually behind all of this. If you'd prefer not to know the denouement of these two overlong 2001 Batman story arcs, just skip ahead a little distance here. But it turns out that behind this whole situation, the person who actually had Vesper Fairchild killed was none other than Lex Luthor. Another big villain reveal for him in this same episode of the Time Bubble. Yes, apparently President Lex, and by early 2002 he was in the White House. He actually had this done to get back, not at Batman, because I don't believe he's aware of the dual identity, but to get back at millionaire Bruce Wayne for not being willing to back Luthor's play during the whole No Man's Land affair a couple of years ago. And Luthor wanted to close off Gotham City after its earthquake and turn it into a no man's land. But apparently Bruce Wayne got himself, and Bruce Wayne and not Batman, got himself on Lex's bad side at that point. And that's why poor Vesper was made to die. And that's why Bruce Wayne found himself in so much hot water for 6 months' worth of Batman storytelling. So, So there you are, the Batman 10-cent adventure. It's kind of an interesting historical curiosity, as I mentioned earlier, because of it represents a step forward in promotional thinking for comic books. It was the first time a comic book could be had at first publication for that cheap in some time. And inasmuch as it touched off a whole 6 months' worth of Batman comics to follow in that year, it's kind of a helpful signpost to plant in the temporal terrain of 2002. And really that's what we here at the Time Bubble are all about. Oh, and one last extra textual note to make here. On the inside front cover of the Batman 10-cent adventure, we have an ad for that Rollerball film remake starring LL Cool J and Rebecca Romaine Stamos. Just in case you've been sitting up late at night wondering when that movie was released. It was released in early 2002. Well, now that we've finally achieved a time bubble milestone and broken through to a new year, having reviewed one of the first comics releases of 2002, let's throw it sharply into reverse and talk about some stuff from 1986. What do you say? Yep, 1 step forward, 16 steps back. That's just the way we like to do things here on the Time Bubble. But seriously, folks, I did find in my reading pile a small vein of back issues in amongst the things that I bought and read around the beginning of 2002. And these are most likely acquired on a Sunday, whichever Sunday afternoon was closest to January 1st, 2002. Because, well, as I know I've mentioned once or twice in this podcast in the past, my dad is a big-time scavenger, right? He enjoys haunting the flea markets, yard sales, garage sales, and so forth, and just always on the hunt for old antique tools, oil paintings, beat-up old furniture that he swears he's going to refurbish and never actually does. And oftentimes, in the past, I have ridden shotgun with him as he goes on these acquisition missions here and there. And when I was in college, we always made it a point, whenever I visited home, and particularly over Christmas and New Year's break, we would usually visit the antique marts and consignment shops of the nearby antiques mecca of Adamstown, Pennsylvania. And I'm pretty sure that the handful of comics that I've got here from earlier days were the result of one such excursion that father and son took right around January 1st, 2002, which happened to be my 23rd birthday. And I'm sure he said something along the lines of, if you see something you want in comics, just pick it up and I'll pay for it as a birthday present. So I managed to scrape together a small pile of things that struck my fancy, and I assume he paid for them. And one of these comics, purchased right around the turn of 2002, is a Marvel Comics publication, cover dating back to February of 1986, and it is a comic book of extreme historical importance. No, I'm not talking about X-Force Annual Number 2, the first appearance of Adam X. That was several years later. No, this is a different X-Men milestone. It is, in fact, X-Factor Volume 1, Number 1. Brought to us by the creative team of Bob Layton, writer, and Jackson Geiss, sometimes known as Butch, penciler. Inks provided in part by the writer, in part by the penciler, and in part by Joseph Rubinstein. And colorists, coloring also done by committee, as Petra Scotese, Max Scheel, and Glynis Oliver all lend their hues to the project. It's a 48-page first issue with only 6 ads, so a lot of content here. And what I have here appears to be a direct market copy, inasmuch as the little corner box in the lower left-hand corner of the cover contains not a UPC symbol, but a little drawing of Captain America's head. So, yes. Now, the title of this double-sized first issue is Third Genesis, which is a title inspired by an earlier story's title. I mean, for those of you counting along Genesis at home, Second Genesis was actually the title of the story in Giant-Sized X-Men number 1 that introduced the all-new, all-different X-Men, and that effectively sidelined the original X-Men team. So here, in X-Factor number 1, the big deal, the original raison d'etre of the first X-Factor series was getting the original X-Gang back together. I mean, as the cover blurb, or one of the 2 cover blurbs, triumphantly proclaimed, "Because you demanded it, the dramatic return of the original X-Men." And the jury is somewhat out as to exactly what percentage of X-Men fandom actually did demand this. It had to be somewhat significant. I mean, it's not that like nobody demanded it, but as we'll see, certain contingents of fandom and at least one comics professional had their misgivings about this particular reunion for reasons that we'll get to in a moment. But anyway, that's the genesis or the origin of the title. It's continuing to count up from the second genesis of the all-new, all-different X-Men. Here's the third genesis, which brings the original team of X-Men, which consists, of course, of Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, brings them back together again for the first time in roughly 10 years in real time. I'm not sure exactly how long that is Marvel Universe time, but long enough for everybody to be happy to see each other when they finally do get back together. So, yes, in effect, X Factor number 1 constitutes kind of a 10-year graduating class reunion for the original X-Men, getting the old gang back together again for the first time in 10 real years. And, I don't... Those of you of a certain age who have attended a few high school reunions of your own have probably had to listen to the complaints of your class officers or presidents or whatever complaining about how difficult it was to pull as many people as they did together and organize everything. Well, I bet those people, not to trivialize their efforts or anything, but I bet none of them had to raise anyone from the dead to make a reunion happen, because that is pretty much what had to be accomplished in order to force this X Factor team through, to get the original group back together. It was easier to gather some characters than others. I mean, in the wake of their X-Men membership, after their graduation, so to speak, the Beast went on to become blue and furry and joined the Avengers for a time. Angel and Iceman bummed out to the West Coast and joined the ill-fated Champions of Los Angeles team. And all three of them ended up as members of the Defenders eventually, and that team was kind of on the decline by the time this team concept was thrown together. So it was easy enough to sample them, but Cyclops and Jean Grey were quite another story, because they had effectively been written out of X-Men continuity some time ago. I mean, I'm sure we're all aware of what happened with Jean Grey in the years following Giant Size X-Men number 1. Cyclops and Jean Grey remained with the team, and then the whole Dark Phoenix saga happened, this seminal, incredibly popular, and fondly remembered story, one of the greatest X-Men stories ever told by Chris Claremont and John Byrne, in which Jean Grey bonded with the Phoenix Force and then ultimately was corrupted, turned into Dark Phoenix thanks to the meddling of the Hellfire Club, was responsible for the death of an entire planet's population, and ultimately sacrificed herself to protect her loved ones and also the rest of the universe from any further depredations she might wreak upon them as Dark Phoenix. So we all know that all that went on, and certainly all of fandom was very keenly aware of that as of 1985, 1986 when these events took place. And then somebody had the bright idea of bringing Jean Grey back from the dead. And that's where the controversial angle of this whole X Factor concept comes from. With a certain factions of fandom being somewhat vehemently opposed to the idea of the original X-Men fully getting back together with Jean Grey involved. Others, I'm sure, were perfectly happy to see Jean Grey back, but others thought, this kind of spits on that masterful Dark Phoenix saga that we all thrilled to just a few short years ago. And Chris Claremont, in particular, was unhappy about this. I mentioned there was at least one comics professional that had strong misgivings about this, and naturally Claremont, who was the author of the Dark Phoenix saga, was not too happy to see Jean stuck back among the living. I mean, I have to give the creators involved credit. They did come up with a fairly imaginative retcon to put this into place, which I discussed in an earlier episode of the Time Bubble. I came across Avengers number 263, which was the first hint of Jean Grey's return, when the Avengers, after foiling the mad scientists of the Enclave, discovered a mysterious human-sized cocoon-like object at the bottom of Jamaica Bay, which is, after all, where the X-Men spacecraft crashed in Uncanny number 100 when Jean rose from the waters as the Phoenix, or when Phoenix rose from the waters as Jean, as the retcon established. And that whole idea of the Jean Grey who went through the events of the Dark Phoenix saga and ultimately sacrificed herself was not actually Jean, but just a simulacrum of Jean, a clone of her body, in effect, created by the Phoenix Force and then inhabited while simultaneously mind-wiping itself to force itself to believe that it was, in fact, Jean Grey, so that it could experience humanity and learn about it firsthand the hard way. It was all pretty clever, and from what I've heard, it all arose from the germ of an idea proposed by a young man named Kurt Busiek, who in the mid-'80s was just kind of rising through the ranks, a fan and letter hack who was in the process of breaking into comics in the mid-'80s. And I think he was kind of hot to impress certain people with his ability as a storyteller and crafter, and I don't know that he ever actually intended for this germ of an idea of a retcon of his to be used, to be put into practice. I think he just wanted to demonstrate his abilities to come up with ideas like that. But sure enough, somebody somewhere, or a group of somebodies somewhere, picked up that idea and ran with it. One of the core conspirators here was actually John Byrne, who was the other author of the Dark Phoenix saga. So if Chris Claremont was unhappy with the idea of Jean returning from the dead and poor Scott Summers' happily ever after with Jean Grey lookalike Madeline Pryor being disrupted, John Byrne seemed fine with it because he actually helped to lay the groundwork for the return of Jean Grey. Actually, putting this reunion together, to return to that analogy, took quite a bit of groundwork. Not just the raising from the dead, but that was a large chunk of it. So as far as Jean Grey being risen from the dead, we needed Avengers number 263, and also Fantastic Four number 286 by the aforementioned Mr. Byrne. Avengers 263 was when the cocoon was found, and Fantastic Four number 286 was when the cocoon hatched and Jean Grey emerged into Reed Richards' laboratory to the astonishment of all. And both of those comics were cover dated January of 1986. So there's your return of Jean Grey. Simultaneously, also in January of 1986, we had Uncanny X-Men number 201 in the wake of the Trial of Magneto story, in which Scott Summers, Cyclops, who had been hanging around with the X-Men for a bit before that, just visiting, he returns from the trial of Magneto to find that his wife, in Cyclops' absence, has given birth to a baby boy whom they name Nathan Christopher Charles Summers. Uncanny number 201 is actually baby Nathan's first appearance, and we all know what big things he went on to. But in Uncanny number 201, we also see Scott succumbing to his baser nature and actually challenging Storm to a duel for leadership of the X-Men, which he, of course, loses. And at that point, he tucks tail and takes his family, who is not particularly happy with him at this point, and then slinking back to Alaska, where Scott and Madeline had retired when he left the X-Men the last time. And as I said before, the happily ever after that Scott had with Madeline, despite the addition of a bouncing baby boy to the mix, it's been pretty effectively destabilized. And so Chris Claremont, probably against his better judgment, but he was a professional, he did contribute to what would be the end of wedded bliss and retirement in limbo for Scott, as he was, in effect, one of the architects of this, which I think he regretted later on. So between those three comics from January of 86, that set the stage for Scott and Jean to return. They were both poised. To round things out, to accomplish the hasty dismantlement of the pre-existing status quos, or stati quo, we want to quibble on Latin grammar here, of all five of the original X-Men. The other three, fortunately, were all in one place at that time. Beast, Angel, and Iceman, as I think I mentioned before, drifted into Defenders membership at some point. Maybe I didn't mention that. Well, I'm mentioning it now. So the Defenders, by the beginning of 1986, had wandered somewhat from the original winning formula of Doctor Strange, Hulk, Namor, and sometimes the Silver Surfer. It changed so much, in fact, that at some point Marvel had the good taste and discretion to retitle it The New Defenders. It basically consisted in the last stage of its original life cycle, of its first volume, of those three original X-Men, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, plus a strange assortment of characters, many of whom were fourth stringers, to be kind. So the three of them, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, by this point, I kind of liken their relationship and their status to like old college buddies who struck out on their own for a time and then ended up moving back in with each other. as they face the challenges of post-collegiate adulthood and gradually expand their social circle to include new friends, girlfriends, wacky neighbors, random acquaintances from the pub downtown, until finally the whole thing collapses under its own weight and the guys decide they have to move on, go their separate ways, and start individual lives. Although that analogy doesn't really hold up, because as the new Defenders living arrangement falls apart, these three guys end up just moving to a new situation, just with two other old friends. But in any event, my point is that the new Defenders had pretty much reached the end of its run naturally by the beginning of 1986, and new accommodations for Beast Angel and Iceman would probably needed to have been found anyway. But anyway, this all came to a head in New Defenders number 152, which was published just a week or two, I think, before X Factor number 1 hit the shelves. And that issue, which was also a Secret Wars 2 crossover, just for further historical context, it was also a double-sized special, and it featured the apparent or literal deaths of most of the other members of the team. So, there we have it. All the 5 original X-Men were at, or were brought to, loose ends just in time for the beginning of this exciting new series, which would bring them back together for new adventures in the mid-'80s. Which brings us back at last to X Factor number 1 itself. Now, after all this setup that I have taken such pains to describe, what actually happens in the first issue itself? Well, I would say about 2/3 to 3/4 of its 42 very condensed story pages. I mean, no kidding. What happens in X Factor number 1 would probably unfold over a whole 4-issue arc nowadays. I say about 2/3 to 3/4 of that is still more setup. We've seen the dissolution of the previous situations of the 5 X-Men unfold in those other comics that I mentioned, published around the end of 85, beginning of 86. So the beginning of this story tells us how these characters then move on from their recently dissolved ties to other series, other situations, and how fate gradually propels them together to become a team once again. And then the remaining third or fourth of the issue shows their first mission together as a reunited or reformed team. It establishes their new status quo and gives us a taste of the kind of adventures that they'll be having together under this new concept, this new premise of X Factor going forward. It opens with a few pages of Scott Summers and Madeline Pryor and baby Nathan makes 3 trying to make their little marriage work up there in Anchorage, and it's not going so well. Scott is becoming increasingly sad and silent and laconic and distant, and which is kind of typical of him. He broods and broods, and Madeline doesn't seem to have the stomach for it, and she knows something is wrong with him, and it comes to a head when she finally just confronts him directly and just point blank asks him, "It's Jean, isn't it? You're thinking about her right now, aren't you?" And with typically terse tactlessness, Scott just says, "Yes." Well, at least he's honest about it. Then we cut immediately to another little scenelet, which takes place as Beast and Iceman are moving their meager belongings out of the sumptuous Rocky Mountains villa of Warren K. Worthington III, alias the Angel, which had been serving as the headquarters of the New Defenders team until said team was mostly massacred in New Defenders number 152. So that team is no longer valid. And Bobby and Hank are just getting their things together, and they're saying their goodbyes to Warren and his girlfriend Candy, who is there, and heading out to begin what is destined to be very short-lived civilian lives, when suddenly, just after Hank and Bobby have taken off, a fateful phone call comes in from New York and is answered by Warren, and sure enough, it's Reed Richards. "Hey, guess what I just hatched in my lab?" And that, of course, is the catalyst that sends all the events of this issue and of the X Factor series to follow into motion. Warren impetuously just throws himself out the door. He just gives Candy Southern a quick kiss, and off he goes to New York. And while we're on the subject here, Candy Southern is a character worthy of a quick mention. Recently on CGS, we did our top 5 supporting characters lists. And Candy Southern is one that ranked pretty high on both my alternates list and Ian's. And speaking for myself, my reasons for putting her that high on my list are kind of in evidence in X Factor number 1, because Candy Southern was always such a good fit for Warren Worthington. Just such a good love interest, bucked a couple of the stereotypes of superhero girlfriends of the Silver and Bronze Ages, in that she was just as much a free spirit as Warren was, and in her own way, even more so than Mary Jane Watson was over in the Spider-Man comics. She was always pretty cool with Warren's superhero lifestyle, and wanted to be with him and to support him and just be a part of that part of his life as much as she was a part of his life as Warren Worthington, wealthy heir and playboy. And so she was actually named like a de facto leader, operations manager, or whatever you want to call it. Like not a field leader, but a support leader of the New Defenders team shortly before it broke up, as we've mentioned several times already in this episode. So when Warren goes dashing off to the East Coast, she's not particularly happy about it, especially since the villa is being renovated at that time and it's crawling with construction workers. And she shouts after him, "You're not going to leave me here alone in a house full of construction workers, are you?" And then she thinks better of it and says, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Yeah, because she's got a fairly strong libido, too. Like I said, she's a freewheeler. And she and Warren just were very good together, which makes her ultimate tragic demise in a later issue of this same X Factor series that much more tragic. But yeah, anyway, she's here, and her special rapport with Warren Worthington, the Angel, is on full display. Although, one further note about Candy. Her natural hair color is black, and although she has been known to dye it from time to time over the course of her appearances in comics, the fact that there are 4 different colorists in this first issue of X Factor is painfully apparent when her color changes from brown to black in the middle of a single scene. Yeah, that's just somebody slipped up in editorial there. Anyway, so the love of Candy's life, Warren Worthington goes off to New York, having been informed of he's the first of the other original X-Men to learn that Jean Grey has surfaced. And so he goes jumping off there. His Peter Pan complex is on full display here at the beginning of this X Factor series. And he's brash, he's impetuous, he's impulsive, he's lusty towards both Candy and the newly revived Jean, because remember, Warren, like every other male member of the X-Men except Bobby back in the old days of the Silver Age, had a crush on Jean when they were teammates. So there's that happening in the background of his mind, and puckish and also, as always, very, very wealthy. So in short, Warren Worthington is so ready for the mid-'80s. So perhaps it's fitting that he's the first one on the scene to greet Jean in her quote-unquote return from the dead, and also to set things in motion to, once he's decided to summon all the other X-Men, wheels start turning in his mind, and he thinks, this is going to be great, getting all the old first class of X-Men back together again. Maybe there's something we can do to keep the party going once everybody is here. And that's what leads to the premise of the ongoing series, which we'll discuss in a little greater detail later on. And eventually, Warren does set up a phone chain to contact the other original X-Men, so we get to catch up with Hank McCoy, the Beast. And if Angel is ready for the 80s, the Beast is somewhat less so, I would say. He was really more a 70s kind of guy. So he's still furry and fiery-tempered and loquacious as ever, just full of 70s hairy-chested machismo. But it's adulterated by understandable active frustration with the prejudice he encounters as he goes on a job hunt amidst the ivy-covered, blue-nosed halls of 80s academia. We do get to see him go on one job interview, and he's basically told by the dean interviewing him that, number one, he's a mutant, which is so scandalous enough, but two, he's also, a former superhero. He had that time with the Avengers, and he kind of, he and Wonder Man went out and did more than their fair share, in fact, of hedonistic carousing in those days, and so the higher institutions didn't really want to have him as a member of the faculty. Now, granted, he wasn't on the job trail for very long before word came from Warren that Jean was back and he needed to come, see her immediately. So if he had been allowed to continue looking for jobs, I'm pretty sure he would have eventually come to a school that would have been only too happy to have Dr. Hank P. McCoy on its faculty, checkered past as a mutant Lothario or not. But so anyway, that's what we see of Hank's personality here, and the problems that he will continue to face as his life in the 80s with X Factor continues to unfold. And then there's Bobby Drake, and Bobby's really just kind of there. We get all of 3 panels of what Bobby gets up to between leaving Warren's pad out in the Rockies and coming back to greet Gene and join the new X Factor. Basically what he's been doing is cooling his heels, no pun intended, at an accounting office someplace. And when the call comes, it takes him a split second to ice up his entire body and run screaming Yahoo from the office, and that's really all we get to see of Bob. There's a couple of things that this issue, chock full as it is, needs more of, and one of those is more of Bobby. There's really not much of him, not much personality development or character time given to him here, except that he's still young and irresponsible, not quite as much, well, actually even more so, I would say, even more so than Warren is, because as he and Hank are moving out of Warren's villa in the Rockies, he just generates an ice slide for the fun of it, and Hank chides him for leaving 200 pounds of ice to melt in the guy's living room while the place is being renovated, no less. So Bobby is still kind of the annoying young tag-along kid brother of the group, and it would have been nice if we'd seen a little bit more of him and where his head is at in this first issue. We get a little, but not quite enough. But anyway, so there's your Warren, there's your Hank, there's your Bobby. But first on the scene, which would come as a surprise to no one, even like chronologically in the flow of the issue's events, before Warren contacts Beast and Iceman and they come running, Scott, of course, wastes no time whatsoever. He's barely hung up the phone by the time he's running for the nearest airport out there in Alaska, leaving a mightily cheesed off and also heartbroken wife, Madeline Pryor Summers, to care for their infant son in his absence. So yeah, Scott, among the portrayal of all the characters in this issue, and this is the opinion of Chris Claremont as well, Scott comes off far the worst in his portrayal in this issue, for much the worst for this reunion born of a Graham Mall retcon, bringing Jean Grey back from the dead and bringing the original X-Men back together. Claremont had always meant for Scott to have a happy ever after. The introduction of this miraculous look-alike of Jean Grey, this Madeline Pryor, complete with meet cute up there in Alaska. I think when Scott was first being reintroduced to his grandparents, who live up there in Alaska, Madeline Pryor was like his pilot or something. So it was kind of a very random meeting, which later continuity would prove was not so random, because eventually we do, of course, learn that Madeline Pryor was a genetic clone of Jean Grey, created by Mr. Sinister after Jean's seeming death, because he was Sinister, that is, wanted desperately not to waste the opportunity of combining the Summers and Grey mutant bloodlines to create the messianic super mutant that would eventually be, Nathan Summers, child of Scott and Madeline, and who would grow up to be Cable, etc. But none of this was in Claremont's mind, of course. All he wanted to show through Madeline was that, oh, yes, there's somebody out there for Scott. The end of Jean's life as Phoenix, etc., didn't need to be the end of Scott's life. This was supposed to be Scott's gold watch, his retirement package, his final reward, an angel-faced psychopump to lead him into comic book limbo when he was written out of the X-Men. But because Jean couldn't rest in peace, neither can Scott, and here comes Scott being dragged back into continuity. And he is portrayed here not very heroically at all until the end of this first issue. But for most of the issue, he comes off like a hopeless, self-destructive addict. One who is only too willing to abandon his wife and infant son to go traipsing across the whole of North America to chase the two-headed dragon of his twin addictions, Jean Grey and team leadership. And he does get his fix of both of them by the end of this issue, and by that point he starts seeming more like the stern, square-jawed leader that some people think of when they think of Cyclops as part of the as leader of the X teams. But for most of the issue, he's just kind of a mess, to be honest, and you can see what an emotional blow the reported return of Jean is to him. Which brings us to Jean herself. All right, now, earlier when I said that this first issue of X Factor was missing a couple of things, one of them being more and better Bobby Drake. Another thing that, in this reviewer's opinion, this issue could have used a little more of was more of Jean Grey from Jean's own POV. More of her own reaction to her sudden and unexpected return from the dead, and her dawning realization that she has been among the dead, so to speak. I mean, technically she was just semi-comatose in a healing cocoon at the bottom of Jamaica Bay, but, the woman was thrown out of her own life for a period of several years, while a cosmic imposter masqueraded as her, stole her life, her memories, her mannerisms, her man, and then ultimately, having stolen her life, brings it to an enviably noble and heroic end. And so, it really gives Jean a death that's hard for Jean returning to life to live up to. And then she pops back to life and awareness and becomes aware and learns all of this. And it's an awful lot to unpack in a short amount of time. You got to figure that there's an awful lot going in Jean's mind at this point. You'd think there'd need to be some kind of recovery period, a period of adjustment, some kind of convalescence physically and emotionally. Maybe she might need to undergo some kind of PTSD counseling, but instead, maybe if any of this is happening for Jean, it's not shown to us as readers, and I think Jean's resurrection, just in literary terms, loses a bit of its credibility and plausibility because we as readers don't get to see whatever comes after Jean's revival. She's just kind of thrown out there, and she's instantly just as vivacious and high-spirited as ever. Just the Jean that Scott remembered. And that's a key point that I'm getting to here. A criticism that I would level at Layton and Company for the way Jean's return to living and active duty as an ex-person in this first issue is that her own reaction to her return to the living is apparently seen as less important than Scott's reaction. I mean, the first time that we as readers see Jean back among the living, back to full vitality, is exactly the same moment when Scott first sees her. And the moment seems like something out of some cheesy, romance-oriented reality program, like some volume of The Bachelor or Bachelorette. Because there's, our host, Warren K. Worthington, brings Scott into the room when he finally arrives from Alaska, and there stands Jean just waiting to be served up to him like a Christmas pudding, and she's all glammed up for him, and it's almost disturbing to see her there. She's wearing a black cocktail dress, heels, jewelry, full makeup, the whole nine. It's like she stepped out of the grave and right into wardrobe to get herself ready for her big reunion date with her old boyfriend. Nope. Here she is, Scott, your dream girl, just as you remember her. No messy convalescence, no recovery, no PTSD, nothing of the kind. You can just pick up with her right where you left off. It's just right out of the box. She's exactly the way you and certain overly nostalgic fans remember her and want her to be. And never mind the fact that you and they and the rest of the world have moved on. Never mind the fact that you have a wife and child, and But Scott's reaction notwithstanding, as I've said, I think I've made abundantly clear here. I feel that this whole thing is constructed mainly for the sake of Scott's character, and I don't think enough of a premium has been placed on the importance of Jean's perspective, the perspective of the person who should be at the center of this big event of Jean's return to the living, i.e. Jean herself. I do feel from just the visual coding of everything that's going on here around Jean and her outfit and the way that we don't see her for the first time until Scott sees her for the first time, that she's been made something of a prop in a story that revolves around her own revival, and, in a tight nutshell, there's a little bit of objectification going on here. That's enough said. All of that said, though, it should be pointed out, though, in fairness, that Jean is not entirely without agency here. She actually, we're told that her telekinetic powers have been increased exponentially as a result of her time in the Phoenix Force's cocoon. Although, and here's a whole other issue, for some reason, her telepathic abilities have gone dormant. again. I mean, she didn't have that much time to get to learn to use them in continuity before the whole tragedy of the Phoenix Force and the plane crash around Uncanny number 100 happened. It had been retconned in there that when she first appeared back in X-Men number 1 in 1963, she had only the telekinetic powers. Eventually, it was revealed that she'd always had telepathic abilities, but the very first time her father had taken her to see Professor Xavier, after she had undergone the traumatic event of witnessing a friend's death in an automobile accident, it had triggered her telepathy, and it was too massively powerful for her to control. It was causing her pain. So Professor X kind of made the snap decision to completely suppress and remove the memory of her telepathic abilities, and she was reunited with them much later on. And then the whole business with the Phoenix happened, and so she had really barely learned how to use them properly when this whole thing happened to her, and now she's back. She's once again sensible, and she no longer has the use of them. And why, one is forced to ask? Only explanation I can think of offhand that doesn't involve more wild accusations of sexism is simply that Bob Layton had a whole bunch of romantic melodrama in mind that he just thought would work better if one of the participants in said melodrama did not have the ability to read other people's thoughts. You can see what I'm saying here. So I guess it's somewhat excusable if you look at it from that point of view. But anyway, Jean is now without her telepathy, but she's just a monster in terms of telekinetic ability. And so right out the starting gate here, we do get to see a little bit of Jean showing her personality. And much as I said that Scott's POV is more important than hers here, how Scott kind of acts as the reader's POV character for seeing Jean after she's returned, Jean herself serves as something of a reader POV character. Just for the state of affairs in the X-Men's corner of the Marvel Universe circa the mid-'80s. Because after Scott gets over the initial shock of seeing the love of his life returned to the living, Jean then proceeds to talk to Scott and Warren about how things have gotten so bad for mutants in the world. Because, as I mentioned earlier, this is right after the trial of Magneto's story in Uncanny X-Men number 200. Magneto has now taken over as leader of the X-Men in Professor Xavier's absence. And this has repercussions throughout the X-Men's world, throughout the Marvel Universe in general. It's kind of brought human-mutant relations to an all-time low. It's caused a pretty serious flare-up in anti-mutant xenophobia in American culture. It's created kind of a conservative backlash against mutants throughout American society, and it's cemented the on-again, off-again outlaw status of the X-Men because they're now being led by a person who is, in essence, a war criminal brought up to trial for crimes against humanity. So this is the X-Men's reality as of 1986. This is the rather bleak backdrop against which X-Men stories were being told, and Jean takes a look around her and decides she does not at all like what she's seeing. And in this, she is kind of acting as a meta-voice, speaking for a certain contingent of X-Men fandom who also don't like what they're seeing, who think that maybe Claremont and company have strayed a bit from the classic formula that was so beloved in the late 70s and early 80s. And so here's Jean, who's kind of stepping back into the Marvel Universe after a prolonged absence. And there may be some fans who had gravitated away from the X-Men comics in recent years who perhaps are taking X-Factor number 1 as an opportunity to step back into reading the X-Men stuff. And Jean disliking the state of affairs for mutants sort of speaks for them. And then, when Jean does confront Scott and Warren, as I mentioned earlier, and asks them, how the hell is Magneto leading the X-Men, and how are the two of you okay with that? The two of them can do nothing but shuffle their feet and hem and haw a little, and sheepishly explain to Jean that it's not really their issue because they're out of heroics and mutant activism right now, both of them. And Jean does not take that news well at all. And here's where we get some little flash of the idea that there might actually be some deeper complications of Jean's time spent in an underwater cocoon for all these years. Like maybe she didn't make such a clean break from her time as a cocooned corpse after all. Because when her temper flares flares up. I mean, it's in the closest thing to introspection that Jean really gets in this issue. We get one little thought bubble from her where she kind of scolds herself for flying off the handle and says, "Way to go, Jeannie. You let that red-headed temper get the best of you. I only wish what I was going to do next. No home, no job." And yeah, but what she's referring to when she talks about her red-headed temper flaring up is when she uses her newly heightened telekinetic powers to blow out the wall of the upper-story hotel room in which Scott, Jean, and Warren are meeting and fly out in a huff. I mean, it's a frightening display of her newly strengthened telekinetic abilities, and it's also kind of irresponsible and irrational and just downright dangerous. It's enough to make you think there's some kind of mental imbalance going on with Jean. It's so bad that Layton, I mean, this was pretty obviously produced in the Marvel style, where the writer produces a plot outline, the penciler does the art and the layout and all that based on that, and then the writer comes back later and produces and adds dialogue to the whole thing. Layton actually has to redeem Jean's impulsive, destructive behavior here with a little caption that says, "Having lowered the debris gently to the pavement with her telekinetic power," the art doesn't actually show Jean doing that, and thereby averting possible danger to pedestrians below. Jean did something that was really a danger to those around her in these couple of panels. We go straight from objectified dream girl to possible psychopath with dangerous telekinetic powers. It's really a little bit unnerving, but at least it shows us that maybe there's a little more going on inside Jean's head, as I suggested that there should be earlier on, than meets the eye when we first get our big Bachelorette-style reveal of Jean alive and well and healthy and dressed to the nines, awaiting Scott. So at least we know that Jean's attitude and her agency are still pretty strong, even if, slightly warped or unhinged by the experiences she's been through recently. And speaking of unhinged and Scott, after this sequence of events, Scott becomes pretty emotionally confused and disturbed, and he just kind of runs out of the hotel and goes AWOL for a couple of days. So then Warren sets about summoning Beast and Iceman to make the little group complete, and then they track down Scott, who's just been wandering aimlessly for a couple of days in a stupor, mumbling to himself, 5 o'clock shadow. And so they kind of take him in, give him a blanket and some hot cocoa, and they bring him back to this strange new building that Warren has recently acquired. And here we are. It's page 30. We get to see the reunion between Beast and Iceman and Jean Grey, which goes a lot better than the reunion of Scott and Jean Grey. And they all settle down in this new building of Warren's to hear his $1 million idea for what the original X-Men can do together now that they've finally found one another. And to help him make his big pitch to his erstwhile teammates, we're introduced to another somewhat important new character making his first appearance in X Factor #1. That would be Cameron Hodge, who is Worthington, Angel's old college roommate. This is a name that's probably familiar to some of you X-fans out there. Cameron Hodge, he would eventually become a pretty significant antagonist in the X-Men universe. At this point, though, you're probably picturing an insane, mutant-hating cyborg who eventually merged with the Phalanx, the techno-organic alien race called the Phalanx. But this is all well before any of that. It's even before we know that he harbors any kind of anti-mutant bigotry, or we learn that he's actually working with a right-wing hate group called The Right. No, here at his humble beginnings, Cameron Hodge is far from the insane supervillain he would eventually become. Instead, he's nothing more than a slightly uptight yuppie with glasses and an MBA, a high-powered 80s PR consultant who also happens to be an old chum of Warren Worthington. Actually, I think he sort of comes out of nowhere in this story, as indeed does the presentation that he makes to the original X-Men. One of the other things that I think this already overstuffed first issue could have used is a little more fleshing out of Cameron Hodge and his shared history with Warren. Just one little one-page scene maybe explaining how Warren looks him up and recruits him for this germ of an idea he's had for something for the original X-Men to do together as a reunited team. But instead, Hodge and this new enterprise that Warren has in mind is just kind of dropped into readers' laps. And it comes as much as a surprise to us as it does to Scott and Jean and Bobby and Hank. And the idea is basically this. The 5 original X-Men will now form a new corporation called X-Factor Mutant Investigations and Solutions. And the idea behind this new mutant team supreme is basically they are going to pose as a bunch of basically paranormal exterminators, a la the still topical as of 1986 Ghostbusters. For mutants, they're going to pretend to be a team of non-mutant Homo sapiens elimination specialists for dangerous superhuman mutants. A bunch of specialists, they're going to publicly advertise their services in this regard. They're going to actually, as a part of his little presentation, Hodge shows the group a TV spot that he's put together, and the original X-Men learn to their horror has already been airing for several days. The text of this ad goes as follows. Every day, more and more people are threatened by the dreaded mutant menace. Law enforcement officials are ineffective and skeptical, while you remain a helpless target of these strange beings. You've heard about them. They live in secret and plan to destroy the very lives of us normal people. But now there is help. Now there is X-Factor, professional investigators who, with the help of today's technology, can protect you and your family from this unseen menace. If you suspect anyone of mutant activity, call this toll-free number now and let the mutant professionals handle it from there. Visa and MasterCard are accepted. You don't have to live in fear anymore. So, yes, the business model as proposed by Hodge and Worthington here is basically the X-Factor team disguise themselves as humans, clean suits and all. They field calls from anti-mutant bigots from throughout the country, arrive on the scene, take statements from said bigots who direct them to the dangerous mutants they're supposed to be apprehending. Then, after they part company with the bigot who's hired them, they change into their brand spanking new X-Men hero costumes, courtesy of Butch Geis. They're basically dichromatic full body suits consisting of one primary color and a secondary color for the gloves and boots, and a large full torso-sized X symbol stretching from shoulders to hips. Pretty striking design. I got to give Geis credit for that. And then in their X-Men identities, then they proceed to round up the dangerous mutant that they've been sicked on. But instead of carting him off to be poked and prodded and incarcerated and possibly dissected for science, whatever line of malarkey they feed to the bigot who hired them, they take the mutant away to a facility like, say, the Xavier Institute, where the mutant can then be sheltered and trained in the use of his or her mutant powers. So the basic idea is taking the widespread grassroots anti-mutant prejudice in the country at this time in history and turning it on itself, taking the fearful public, the world that hates and fears mutants, and using their bigotry as a way to crowdsource information. Just kind of using a fearful, hateful public as X-Factor's own personal Cerebro system to locate new mutants and get them the help they need to adjust to their powers. And as icing on the cake, they also get to charge an arm and a leg of the all-American bigots that they're using as their unwitting informants. So they get to exploit people's ignorance for the good of mutants and also make a monetary profit on top of that. Yeah. So that's kind of the premise of this new X-Factor series, and do I really need to explain at length what a patently horrible idea this whole thing is? Unfortunately, at least there's an in-story reaction from the X-Men characters as to how disastrous this business model, as I've called it, really is, or would be if it were being taken. Just look at the bottom of page 31. Look at the look of horror on Hank McCoy's face. That kind of says it all. And a couple of pages later, Scott Summers is having some serious doubts himself. At the top of page 34, he says, this whole thing is ludicrous. It's not going to work. So I seriously hope that writer Bob Layton never really intended for this story conceit to last or to be taken seriously, because, right on the face of it, it's perfectly obvious that if something like this were actually attempted, it would be an absolute disaster. It would backfire enormously. It would stoke mutant hysteria. Heck with exploiting it. It's the advertising alone makes it clear that it would encourage the kind of anti-mutant sentiment that was running rampant in the country. It wouldn't really matter if in the short term they were able to exploit anti-mutant prejudice for mutant benefit. They'd still be deepening trends of bigotry and fear and misunderstanding and ignorance. Yeah, enough said. But all the same, this is what they're going with. And despite the team's strong misgivings and those of at least this reader, the original X-Men decide they're going to give it a try and field at least one call. And so that's where their first mission comes in. And here, throughout the bulk of the issue to this point, we've been seeing there is interspersed kind of a B story, which introduces us to the hapless young mutant whom the X-Factor team will be hunting/helping as part of their first mission. And that's where we meet a young boy named Rusty Collins. Well, he's not really that young, Rusty Collins. He's a young man here. He's in his 20s. I'm sure a lot of you who've been reading Marvel Comics for a while, especially the X-Men books, will recognize the name Rusty Collins. He's been knocking around the X titles for several years. I think he and the young lady named Skids were romantically involved for a time, and I think they were supporting characters in New Mutants and in X-Force for a while. But this is Rusty's first appearance, and right out of the starting gate here, he's kind of a poster child for dangerous and uncontrollable mutant powers that manifest on the sudden at the least convenient time. So Rusty, he's an ensign in the U.S. Navy when we meet him in this story, and his loudmouth, two-dimensional lunkhead of a superior officer, a Captain Fisher by name, takes Rusty out for a bit of shore leave. They go out and get plastered at a bar, and the captain then has the brilliant idea of introducing Rusty to the captain's, that is, favorite prostitute. And the two go for some quality time out in an alley behind the bar. Rusty is not very comfortable with the whole thing. He gets a little overheated in more ways than one, and his mutant power chooses to reveal itself at that time for the first time in poor Rusty's life. And he ends up, his power is flame-based, as it turns out, and he ends up pretty much immolating this woman with whom he's having a make-out session in the alley behind the bar. Just burns her very badly. She doesn't die, but she's pretty severely injured. Yeah, poor Rusty's power set is kind of the inverse of Pyro's of the Brotherhood. Cinch and Allardyce, whose deal was always, he can control the flames, but he can't create them, which is why he always wore those big honkin' twin flamethrowers on his costume. Well, Rusty's pretty much exactly the opposite. He can create the flames, but he definitely can't control them, which is exactly the source of his problem here. He can't control the flames, and as a result, he burns this unfortunate prostitute to a crisp and very nearly ends her life. And Captain Fisher, who is, of course, an anti-mutant bigot, personally sees to it that Rusty is taken into custody by military police. And after that, he further personally sees to it that his prison guards look the other way while Captain Fisher visits Rusty and proceeds to try to beat him within an inch of his life. Rusty's powers flare up again. He melts right through the wall of the prison and goes on the lam. And it's at this point that Captain Fisher, fearing reprisals for his very much unauthorized visit to and attempted murder of a military detainee, he decides he needs to call in some professionals to clean up his mess, and so he contacts X-Factor. And so X-Factor goes diving into action for and this is the second the cover blurb on this first issue of X-Factor, Baptism of Fire, which is a reference to Rusty's powers. I'm sure you get the gag there. So X-Factor goes into action in pretty much the way I've described. The three most human-looking X-Factor members, Scott, Jean, Bobby, they don their clean suits, and I have here in my notes that they basically assume Mike Murdoch-style second secret identities. You'll remember that brief period in the Silver Age when Matt Murdock was masquerading as both Daredevil and his own fun-loving party animal twin brother, Mike Murdoch? Well, here we see Scott, Jean, and Bobby adopting two different secret identities. Their mutant hero code names of Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Iceman, and also Agents A, B, and C of X-Factor. Just a human specialists in mutant detainment. So they go and they talk to Captain Fisher, determine that he's a scumbag right away, and with the tips that he gives them, they go into action. They switch into their costumes, they round up poor Rusty, make a big show of defeating him and spiriting him away in the full sight of actual military personnel who are also on hand to apprehend Rusty. And the X-Factor team stuffs poor Rusty into a big asbestos bag. Yes, really. And away they fly in their specialized aircraft. Mission more or less accomplished, I guess. And then they give an enormous bill of like $42,000 to Captain Fisher, who complains that it's 2 years' pay. But when they threaten to just let Rusty go and maybe tip off the military into the bargain, suddenly the captain doesn't feel he's so ill-used, and there we go. X-Factor flies off, having a good laugh at Captain Fisher's expense, and when they're at a safe distance, they let Rusty out of the asbestos gunny sack they stuffed him in, give him some fresh clothing, since he burned his off long since, and they reassure him that he's not being taken to a lab or another prison. He's just being taken to a safe house or a facility where he'll be able to get the training and counseling he needs to adjust to life as a superpowered mutant in peace and seclusion. And so I guess the X-Factor team puts this one in the win column, I suppose, as they fly home. And Warren triumphantly declares, X-Factor is here to stay. But just to put a little bit of a damper on the happy ending here, we close on a quick scene of Madeline Pryor, the tragically forgotten other woman, sitting by the TV, looking at the ad for X-Factor airing out there in Alaska with one eye and looking at a framed photograph of Scott holding baby Nathan with the other. And so, yeah, there's a lot of angst and a lot of heartache to come between, and lots of little love triangles popping up all over the place to come in future issues of X-Factor Volume 1. So there you have it. There's the beginnings of the storied franchise of X-Factor. It's the premise was pretty badly flawed from the beginning, in my opinion, and I don't know if these were flaws of which Layton was aware and planned to remedy at some point. His relative inexperience as a writer is on display here. This is not his first time writing something for comics, but it's not very strong work, and it's not terrible, but it displays a relative lack of aptitude, in my opinion. It shines through several cracks in this oddly paced introductory yarn. I've mentioned several times that it's 42 pages, and it's telling a lot of story, even for an extra-sized 42-page narrative. It's certainly not decompressed. If anything, a little too much is flung together and flung at the reader too fast. Also, apart from his pacing, Layton's prose is a little bit stylistically clunky. Yeah, to be honest, I'd forgotten, if I ever was aware to begin with, that Bob Layton had written the first 5 issues of this series. I kind of thought it was Louise Simonson from Go, but it was, in fact, Louise Simonson who took over after Layton departed and took a few steps to redeem this premise from the aforementioned flaws and just kind of walk back the series from the idea of mutants posing as mutant hunters to fool a bigoted public, which, as I've said several times before, yikes. The artwork by Butch Geis, on a happier note, is much less inviting of criticism. I mentioned his costume designs are strong for the new X-Factor team. His artwork, his storytelling, his panels, it walks a fine line between Paul Smith impression and John Byrne impression, but shows hints of its own identity too, because Jackson Geis was relatively new to comics work himself, but like Butch Geis, is certainly not a complete newcomer. Closer to it than Layton was at this point. But in addition to doing what I assume was meant to be pursuing a kind of X-Men house style here, he's also showing flashes of real individuality and creativity. I'm especially fond of just a few panels scattered throughout the series, scattered throughout this first issue, of Madeline Pryor. She reacts to the emotional wounds inflicted on her by her lover Scott, and she just emotes all over the damn page. She's just, there's a couple of them where she actually looks right out at the reader. It's just total soap opera grade hammy emotivity shading into deliberate camp. It's almost worthy of Liechtenstein. Yeah, just the bottom of page 3 is one good example. Also the bottom of page 16 when Scott storms out on her to go fly across the country to Jean, and also the aforementioned final panel on page 42 when she's watching the X Factor commercial and openly weeping. It's now, here's where I'm going to turn to Bionic Dave Goldschmidt, who's a devoted listener to the Time Bubble podcast and also used to work in the soaps. He taught me the invaluable vocabulary term SORAS, or SORAS, if you'd rather, SORAS, Soap Opera Rapid Aging Syndrome, which describes the tragicomically brief childhoods experienced by characters in soap operas. That they're born, and within 1 or 2 seasons, suddenly they've aged to adolescence and they're having love affairs of their own. Maybe he has a term for this, too. I'm thinking of the prolonged, silent camera close-ups of characters at the end of scenes in soap operas. Just before we cut to the next scene, the camera kind of lingers on a character as he or she reels from some recent revelation or just wallows in the extreme over-the-top emotion of the moment, of some blow that's just been dealt to the character. That's basically what Geis is showing us in these few panels I've described. They're just silent panels of Madeline Pryor just sitting there suffering on panel. And Geis just brings that across very well. It's a little bit humorous in kind of a sly, subtle way. And I just enjoy those few little hammy moments in this script very much. So there you go, the long-anticipated reunion of the original X-Men in X Factor #1. I didn't really. The X Factor #1 actually came up in conversation on Comic Geek Speak proper a few months ago, and Chris Eberly held forth on it, and I don't know that I was ever really that strongly aware of how controversial the return of Jean Grey from the seeming dead had been at that time. Because, when I started reading comics in the early 90s, and by then Jean's return from the dead had become pretty well normalized and had been made to seem like an inescapable fact of history. Of course Jean Grey returned from the dead. It was always going to happen. She used to call herself Phoenix, after all. So I guess it never really impacted on me how certain fans might have been unhappy about this. But now, thanks to Chris and a little background reading and a closer look at the way this story was told, I think I do now get, in the context of the time, how this story might have been a little bit divisive among X-Men fandom at the time. And it's my pleasure to have presented such a bumpy spot in the road of X-Men history to my listeners here aboard the Time Bubble. And though it may have gotten off to a bumpy start in more ways than one, controversial subject matter, questionable premise, not the strongest scripting, it apparently did take hold, and particularly under the authorial guidance of Louise Simonson. And although it underwent several creative team changes and even 1 or 2 core reconceptualizations over the next several years, the series went on to last well into the 90s, ran for nearly 150 issues. Probably best remembered by some, myself included, for what happened after the original X-Men moved on and folded themselves back into the main X-Men team, and the new team of characters starring Alex Summers and Polaris and Wolfsbane and a few others under the pen of Peter David. That's I tend to think more of that as that's my X Factor. I'm really a bit less familiar with this iteration of the team, just as an excuse to get, as a vehicle for the reunion of the original X-Men. So it's kind of pleasant to be able to, wrap my head around the original concept of X Factor at length here in my own little spin-off podcast, and I thank you all for bearing with me through that journey. And one further note here before we move on to something else, some other things that were coming out the same month as X Factor #1 from the House of Ideas back in at the very beginning of '86. The 8th issue of the 9-issue miniseries Secret Wars 2, Many That Shall Live in Infamy. The 75th and final issue of ROM Space Knight, another watershed moment for Marvel fans of a certain age. Thor #364, the famous Frog of Thunder story. Issue number 227 of Daredevil, which was a part of the Born Again story, much beloved of Chris Eberle, Kevin Moyer, and legions of others. The final issues of the Longshot and Nightcrawler miniseries, two other titles from the X-Men family. A full-length, extra-sized Marvel Treasury film adaptation of a movie that was pretty special to me in my childhood. It was published as Marvel Super Special number 39. It's an adaptation of Santa Claus the movie from the producers of Superman the movie, and starring Dudley Moore and John Lithgow. And on the Bullpen Bulletins page, the announcement of the winners of the first official Marvel Tryout contest. And those winners included, as plotter and scripter, one Chuck Duffy of L.A., California. For colorist, P. Janine Pazda of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And a few better-known names, letterer Robin Riggs of the UK, who became better known as an inker eventually, the person who won the inking award, Doug Hazelwood, and penciler, I think most of you see this coming if you know your comics history well enough, Mark Bagley. Yep. It's a real Cinderella story there. Mark Bagley kind of had his rise to fame as the winner of the Marvel Tryout contest, and he's had a long and storied career ever since. He's kind of the Kelly Clarkson of the Marvel bullpen. Well, that's more than enough expatiation out of me. What say we leave X Factor #1 and all of its highs and lows behind us now, and move on to something else. I actually had 2 other comics prepared to discuss in detail, but time grows short, and I've actually been involved in this recording session for longer than you know. So, why do you say we move on to another comic that, like X Factor #1, was published sometime around the end of 1985, but was purchased by me at the very end of 2002 during that aforementioned excursion to the antique marts with my dad. This would be Action Comics number 572, cover dated October of 85, so probably came out somewhere around July of that year. Yep, as a matter of fact, the week of July 25th, checking the Meanwhile page and the DC checklist inside the back cover. So yeah, this is a comic that was published just around, exactly around the halfway point of Crisis on Infinite Earths. As a matter of fact, there's a little caption on the very first page stating editor's note, the editor in this case being, of course, the legendary Julie Schwartz. The events depicted in this issue's stories occurred prior to the dramatic developments now appearing in Crisis on Infinite Earths. So there you go. This comic was published midway through Crisis, so it's definitely the pre-Crisis Earth 1 Superman we're seeing, and about 1 year prior to the Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow story by Alan Moore, Kurt Swan, and George Perez, which is regarded universally as the final story of the pre-Crisis Earth 1 Superman. But this issue contains not one, but it's a suite of 3 short stories featuring the pre-Crisis Superman, and it appears to be functioning as kind of a, to borrow a familiar phrase to DC Comics' publishing oeuvre of the time, a new talent showcase, or at least a new-ish talent showcase for the writers whose work appears in this issue. The pencilers were at the time a bit better known, or one of them quite well known. So you might think of it as a kind of a Superman tryout book of sorts, for two of the three writers involved anyway. The first one, as we'll see in a second, had already had his tryout, or a couple of tryouts even. So anyway, the first of the three stories, the title story, the cover story, in fact, it's called The World of Superman Masqueraders, and it is written by Craig Boldman, whom, if I just said, had actually had his work appear in a couple of Superman stories prior to this one. In fact, if you look at the letters column at the end of this issue, it refers to Craig Boldman's having written a backup story in Action number 568. I've learned through a bit of research that he actually did a handful of Superman stories before and after number 572 of Action Comics. And he would go on to do a few things for Eclipse Comics along the way, a couple things for Dark Horse. Nowadays, he's best known for his work for Archie Comics, and he is, in fact, the writer, and this I'd known without doing any research, of the daily Archie newspaper comic strip, in partnership with artist Henry Scarapelli. So this story, The World of Superman Masqueraders, is actually a sequel to a story that had run in Action Comics number 234 in 1957, 28 years earlier. And both stories, the story from number 234, which was titled The Creature of 1,000 Disguises, and this story were penciled by the same person, Superman artist par excellence, Wayne Boring. Yes, he had just recently, as of the mid-'80s, he came back to DC for a little while and was able to pick up some work there on various Superman stories and a couple of Golden Age Earth 2 type stories being written by Roy Thomas. This was not his final penciling job for DC, although the said final story would come through from DC all too soon after this, I'm afraid. But he got a few more stories in after what he did for Action number 572. And so this story, it puts Superman back in touch with the title character of the Creature of 1,000 Faces from Action number 234, who is a mischievous, shape-changing alien creature named Gallo from the planet Zar, Z-A-R, Zar. And Gallo's bag is his natural form is kind of a large sauropod creature. He looks kind of like a cartoon brontosaurus with big red Barney Google eyes, which is the one feature that he typically retains no matter what shape he changes into. He changes into a steamship or a skyscraper, it's probably going to have those big red round eyes. When he first came to Metropolis back in 1957, he was just a kid playing pranks. But he turns up in Metropolis again as an adult looking for help. Before Gallo makes his presence known, however, Clark Kent gets kind of a surprise on the very first page of the story when he's visited at his apartment at 244 Clinton Street in Metropolis by an astronomer friend of his who recently, while looking through his telescope at the moon, saw a scene of a whole crowd of people who all look exactly like Clark Kent. Glasses, blue suits, slightly slouched posture, suspiciously weak constitution, etc. And Clark, neither he nor the astronomer quite know what to make of this, so they just kind of mutually shrug, and Clark sleepwalks through the rest of his day, not knowing what to make of a civilization of Clark Kent duplicates existing apparently on the moon. He kind of sleepwalks his way to a Metropolis Founders Day parade that he's covering with Lana Lang for WGBS, when suddenly one of the Superman balloons comes to life. And confronts Superman, and it turns out that this Superman balloon was never really a balloon. It's Gallo of Zar, imitating Superman, and choosing this as a way of making a dramatic entrance to ask Superman for help. So the two of them fly off to the moon, where the mystery of the Clark Kents on the moon is explained. The astronomer was just looking through a stargate of sorts, a space warp, a wormhole leading to Gallo's far-distant home planet. So the Clark Kents are not really on the moon, they're on the planet Zar, where a major vogue has developed, apparently, after Gallo's childhood visit to Earth back in 1957. He went back to Zar and showed all of his friends and playmates this cool new shape he learned there. This was the most interesting thing I saw there, fellows. And they all liked that Clark Kent/Superman shape so much that they all started walking walking around in the form of giant Clark Kents. Giant because Zarians are significantly larger in stature than humans are, which is why Gallo was able to imitate things like steamships and skyscrapers on his last visit to Metropolis. So the problem that Gallo came to Earth to find Superman to help him solve is the fact that he and his fellow peaceful Zarites are being constantly attacked, and have been for some little time now, by wild beasts on planet Zar. Beasts that used to keep their distance from the Zarites, but that now are just attacking regularly, and it plays into this whole Clark Kent Superman copycat fad that's all the rage among the Zarians these days. It gives them an excuse to go scrambling off as Clark Kent, moaning, "Oh, my poor weak stomach! Oh, I forgot I have to make a phone call! Oh, I've tripped!" And then they rush off making their weak excuses, and then find, I guess, their planet's version of a phone booth, and then transform into Superman duplicates, and come back to try and fight off the alien beasts the way that their idol Superman would, except that they don't have Superman's invulnerability, and some of them are getting seriously hurt in these beast encounters. But then Superman, after a little time among the Zarians and observing their behavior and that of the beasts, comes to a conclusion, and that is that the reason these beasts are attacking in the first place is tied directly to this Clark Kent/Superman imitation fad. The beasts have kind of an instinctual, deep-rooted fear of the Zarians' natural shapes, those sort of brontosaurian green lumpy things that they wear as their normal shapes, and that they've kind of disdainfully put off in favor of the much cooler import shape of Clark Kent or Superman. So Superman encourages them to just turn back into their normal selves, and sure enough, as soon as they do, all the different alien creatures turn tail and run at the mere sight of them. So there you go. Problem mostly solved, and it results in this nice little moral about the importance of being oneself. Or something like that. It's kind of a nice little twist on the classic old Star Trek trope of the planet of the impressionable genre fans. Like instead of a cowboy planet or a gangster planet or even a Star Trek Federation starship planet, it's a Superman planet. And imitating Superman nearly was the downfall for these peaceful alien shape-shifting cultural appropriators. Why don't we just call them that? You can also see this story as possibly making a statement that speaks to the rash of incidents of injuries to children as a result of imitating Superman and his superhuman antics, tying towels around their necks and jumping out of windows, which the United States did see a spike in incidents like that in the wake of the release of Superman the movie back in 1978. In fact, it was concern about that led, just as a side note here, Mr. Rogers to put his show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood back into production because he felt he needed to address America's children about imitating superheroes and the dangers of believing oneself to have superpowers that one does not. So maybe this is Craig Boldman's own version of Mr. Rogers talking about superheroes, just trying to send a little message about how it's better to simply be oneself, and it can be dangerous to pretend to be Superman if one does not have the powers to back it up. For me personally, it was just this story is cool, not only because it's some latter-day Wayne Boring Superman artwork, but also because it's it's an example of a writer going back and digging up an old Silver Age, or I don't know, maybe 1957 might even count as Atomic Age in Superman's case, story of bringing it back into current continuity in 1985. So yeah, that was the lead story of this issue, and a pretty good one if I do say so myself. Just good, clean fun. The second story is called SOS from Nowhere, and it's written by somebody named Beppe Sabatini, who is a person who has had almost no other comics writing credits. He actually did appear, going back to my figurative use of the term New Talent Showcase, he literally had a story appear in the back pages of an issue of DC's New Talent Showcase shortly before this, and before Action Comics number 572, but that and this are the only two stories that I believe he ever wrote for DC. He had a couple of things published for Eclipse, but that was kind of the extent of it. I'm pretty sure he's been out of comics for some time, and was barely in them to begin with. But anyway, he did write this story and get it published, along with artwork by Howard Bender, and inks by Bob Oxner. So this story, it opens with Superman. It's an incredibly 80s image. Superman with a big smile on his face, soaring through the spaceways with big antennaed headphones on his head and what looks like a Walkman cassette recorder around his neck, listening to the music of the spheres on headphones. Totally early 80s. But while he's so engaged, just doing a little bit of music appreciation out there amongst the cosmos, he receives what seems to be a telepathic distress signal, very weak and very primal sounding, but he picks it up somehow, and it draws him down to a nearby planetoid, where he discovers a couple of creatures called sarikars, which, to my eye, resemble... They have the body of an ocelot, the tail of a rat, and the head of a Furby. This is back in 1985, yet before Furbies hit the toy market. But yeah, you ever pick up a copy of this issue, just take a look and see if these things don't bear a striking resemblance to these toys to which I refer. And they're being hunted by a pair of humanoid hyenas who are minions of a mysterious interstellar big game hunter known as Star Hunter the Trophy Lord. Or perhaps Trophy Lord the Star Hunter. He's kind of interchangeably referred to by those two epithets. And Trophy Lord Star Hunter, whatever, he's a white-furred lupine humanoid being who looks shockingly similar to George Perez's redesign of the Man-Wolf character for the Star God strip at Marvel right at the end of the 70s. Resemblance is probably not accidental. But anyway, Superman doesn't really cotton to what's being done to these two poor creatures, because the fact that they were able to reach out to him telepathically, even though they're clearly just feral at this point, they're just like animal levels, but the fact that they have some kind of low-level telepathy is enough to tell Superman that they're intelligent, sensate creatures who deserve his protection. And so he makes it clear to the minions of Star Hunter that these two creatures are off limits, but Star Hunter won't take no for an answer, because these are apparently the last two surviving sarikars in the galaxy, tremendously valuable for their pelts. He wants them badly enough to go up against the last son of Krypton to get them, and that's exactly what he does. And since the last son of Krypton is a notoriously tough opponent, things do not go well for Star Hunter, especially when he threatens Earth. If Superman does not back off and let him have the sarikars, that's when Superman gets a little bit tougher, but still manages to penetrate Star Hunter's flagship without causing any loss of sentient life. He just bursts in there and, in Star Hunter's own alien tongue, demands his surrender. Really badass moment. And Star Hunter, of course, surrenders on the spot, and Superman is then able to take the two sarikars back to the Fortress of Solitude, where he uses shrinking technology, similar to what Brainiac used to use, to reduce the two surviving sarikars down to tiny size and puts them in a little bottled jungle environment, very similar visually to the bottle that contains the bottle city, or at least, I think by 1985, Kandor had already been re-enlarged and resituated on a planet somewhere as a Kryptonian colony called Rokin. So maybe it's the very same bottle that used to hold the bottle city of Kandor. But anyway, he uses it as a preserve, like a miniaturized habitat for these two sarikars until he can figure out a way to help them to breed and repopulate, overcome the inbreeding problem, as he states. And no sooner does he put them into this bottle, though, when suddenly up pops, with the onomatopoeic sound effect, pop, a pair of humanoid sarikars, humanoid bodies, but those same unmistakable Furby heads. And it turns out that they are the highly evolved descendants of the two sarikars Superman has just saved from millions of years in the future, come to personally thank Superman for saving their race and for being the model and inspiration for the ethos of altruism, compassion, and peaceful conduct that would eventually evolve among the Sarikar in the eons to come. And they confer upon him the Superman Medal, which is the highest honor that their future civilization has to bestow on anyone. So, there you go. It's a nice, heartwarming story about the dividends that good deeds can ultimately pay. A good turn today can reap rich rewards for you and for many others tomorrow. It's a good kind of Superman moral, don't you think? And now, the third of the 3 8-pagers appearing in Action Comics number 572, a little ditty called The Puzzle of the Purloined Fortress. The pencils for this story are by Rick Hoberg, the inks by Steve Mitchell, and it's written by somebody named Mark Waid. That's right, my bubble brethren. Now it becomes clear why I went out of my way to include this odd little issue of Action Comics number 572. Because it features the first ever published comics scripting by Mark Waid. Prior to this, I think he'd kind of eased into comics through the avenue of comics journalism. I think he worked for the Amazing Heroes magazine for a time, but this is the first time he actually sold a script to a comics publisher. And Waid himself is not especially proud of this one. I can remember reading an interview with him in a long ago issue of Wizard magazine, in which the subject of his first published story came up, and he kind of laughed it off with kind of a wince of pain and made some crack about how this story deserved to be locked away in a vault somewhere and never read again. But I unvaulted it, friends and Bubble listeners, and I am now describing its glories to you, whether Mr. Waid likes it or not. The Puzzle of the Purloined Fortress. The story involves Superman paying a social call to his old friend Pete Ross and Pete's young son Jonathan. Remember John Ross? Remember that one time when Superman got talked into deserting him on an alien planet so he could grow up and fulfill his destiny of being a freedom fighter? Yeah, I remember. That was a really bad Member Berries impression. But this is something that actually happened in the Superman comics. I know I mentioned it in passing, perhaps, on an earlier episode of The Time Bubble. It was in DC Comics Presents number 13, written by Paul Levitz, when Jonathan Ross, son of Superman's pal Pete Ross, was abducted off-planet by members of the alien Nervin race, who had some kind of prophecy that... Is that the way it went down, or was it that they abducted him for other reasons, or he was accidentally sent there, and it was the Legion that came back in time, and that was the team-up of that issue, which probably had something to do with why Paul Levitz was writing it. But, Superman and the Legion were at odds. Superman wanted to take John Ross home to his father. The Legion talked him into letting John stay there because they knew that in the future, John was going to grow up to lead an important rebellion on planet Nervin, or to help stave off alien invaders or something. He had an important heroic destiny on planet Nervin that the Legion did not want Superman to mess up, so Superman, perhaps against his better judgment, decided to leave John Ross on this alien planet, and then his buddy Pete went insane and became a Superman-hating supervillain for a brief time, was institutionalized even, and then a little over a year real time after that story ran, in DC Comics Presents again, and again written by Paul Levitz. Apparently he had... repented of whatever writerly urges led him to write this particular story of Superman condoning child abandonment and kidnapping and what have you. And so Superman went back to Nervin, I guess did something to see to it that the Nervin would have their prophesied champion eventually, and brought little John Ross back home to Pete, which apparently caused Pete to immediately snap out of whatever psychoses his son's kidnapping and absence had inspired in him. He just snapped right back to normal and became Superman's pal again, and they put the whole messy affair behind them. And so by the time we get to this issue, Superman and Pete are pals, and Superman's just stopping by to see how Pete's doing and how little John is doing with his school lessons. And John is having difficulty with computers. And... Superman offers to take John on a special tour of the Fortress of Solitude, where he has some pretty advanced computing technology to maybe inspire John in his studies a bit. But when they get there, they find that just about everything in Superman's fortress, all his computers, his scientific equipment, his intergalactic zoo, even the Phantom Zone projector, they all seem to have disappeared. So here is a little mystery that Superman and John have to solve together. Superman's super brain tumbles to the real solution to this riddle almost immediately, but he decides inwardly that this could be a teachable moment, and he resolves that he's just going to play dumb and use this situation as, quote, a lesson in deductive reasoning for little John. So the two of them puzzle through the situation together, and Supes somewhat Socratically talks John through it and kind of coaxes his thought processes along. It helps John to eliminate the impossible until what they're left with is the truth. And along the way, they consider maybe some member of Superman's rogues gallery pulling off this fortress heist. And the three top suspects that Superman names are Luthor, Brainiac, and Terraman. That's right. I love the Terraman character personally, but he's just so sublimely silly. He's a space cowboy. He's literally a Old West cowboy who rides a winged horse through outer space. He's a rider of the Stellar Sage, and I've always enjoyed him. He's one of my favorite faces of the Bronze and early Copper Age Superman comics. And it's kind of funny to be looking back to 1985 that there was a time when this outer space owl hoot was considered one of the top threats, the most dangerous criminal minds in Superman's rogues gallery, or at least as far as Mark Waid was concerned at the time. But anyway, finally, they divined that this was something of an inside job. Apparently, Superman was engaged in playing a game of some kind of chess with the master computer of his fortress when a giant magnetic meteor passed by Earth, and the magnetism of the meteor caused the computer to go on the fritz and continue playing chess even when Superman flew away to deal with the threat the meteor posed to Earth. It kept on playing chess and capturing everything in the fortress and shunting it out of sync with reality, kind of doing the vibrational shift thing and sending it to, I guess, possibly another alternate Earth somewhere in the multiverse or maybe another dimension. But anyway, Superman and John then have to come up with another source of magnetism to undo the damage done by the computer, having been shorted out by the magnetism of the meteor. And so Superman actually has to sacrifice the giant golden key to the fortress. Of course, he can recreate it with relative ease, but temporarily, Superman has to reduce the golden key to just a giant spool of gold wire, which he and John are then able to use to generate the kind of magnetic charge needed to reverse what had happened to the computer and let Superman, in the blink of a human eye, reprogram said computer and use it to bring all of his stuff back, including his alien pets, who were probably pretty spooked by having been shunted to another dimension. So, Superman and John have their little adventure and their exercise in problem solving, and then they can finally get down to having their tour of the fortress. And there you go. Mark Waid's first published work. And I gotta say, I don't think it's as bad as Mark Waid remembers it being or thinks that it was, but I gotta say, I have kind of a short list of things that it reads more like than it does like what I think of as Mark Waid's style, what comics fandom as a whole has come to know as Mark Waid's style. You can tell that it's early days in his evolution as a writer, and he would hone that craft a bit at DC, actually, when he took a job as an editor and eventually took over the Secret Origins title at DC by the time it ended. So it reads more like one of those Superman Goes to Radio Shack promotional comics of the early 80s. It reads more like an episode of Mr. Wizard with Superman in the title role. Most of all, it reads more like one of those classic riddle or mystery stories for which Cary Bates and Elliot Magan, both of them protégés of DC editor Mort Weisinger, became famous. And they wrote a lot of stories of that type in the Bronze Age. Some of them Superman stories, some of them Flash stories, etc. I mean, Weisinger taught his young apprentices, come up with some strange mystery, then think of like the first 5 solutions to that riddle or mystery you think of, throw them all out, just to make sure that the reader's first 5 guesses aren't going to be correct either, and then proceed from there. It kind of felt like one of those stories, but one thing it did not read like is the work of Mark Waid as you or I would recognize it today. But still, it was a fun little late Bronze Age Superman yarn, guest starring Pete and John Ross, and it's also kind of a fun little nod back to the state of computing technology of the day. And for those of you out there who are interested in experiencing Mark Waid's first published work for yourselves, it is once again Action Comics number 572. Just look for the lovely cover by one of my favorite Superman artists, Eduardo Barreto, of a giant Superman holding a pair of circus elephants by the scruff of their necks. The cover blurb reads, "World of Superman Masqueraders," and it's got Superman standing in the foreground, looking on with some surprise. And so there you have it, the taking of Action Comics number 572, 1, 2, 3. 3 short stories. And I mentioned earlier that I had 2 other things to mention in detail, but I think I'm going to save the second of those comics for another time, because the hour grows late, and I would kind of like to wrap this up at long last. So I'm just going to jump straight into a pile of tiny bubbles that I have here. A couple of them more slightly older comics obtained at some flea market or consignment shop around 2001, 2002, and also some other things that were actually published around that time. So first I have The Incredible Hulk number 254 from December of 1980. This is a part of Bill Mantlo and Sal Buscema's run, and the cover copy reads, "The Hulk faces 4 fantastic new enemies waiting for the UFOs." That's right, this is the first appearance of Vector, Vapor, X-Ray, and Ironclad, the UFOs, the team that answers the question, what if the Fantastic Four had been a bunch of heels with different powers and a very different moral code? Well, technically that question had already been answered by the Red Ghost and his Super Apes years before, but technically that group consisted of 1 heel and 3 trained apes. This team consisted of 4 human beings, the sinister, power-hungry millionaire Simon Utrecht, after whom the group is nominally named, that and to create a terrible pun on the initialism UFO. But Utrecht and 3 hirelings set out in a spaceship to deliberately recreate the accidental exposure to cosmic rays that turned Reed Richards and friends into the Fantastic Four. And it was Bruce Banner's typical bad luck that after a stint as the Hulk, he stumbled, after some lost time, into the desert shack that Utrecht and company had been using as ground control, and quickly interpreting the situation, Banner, trying to be a good Samaritan, operated the spaceship controls to bring the ship back to Earth before Utrecht and his 3 companions died of radiation poisoning. They emerged from the ship spoiling for a fight because, as far as they're concerned, Banner ruined their opportunity to absorb still more cosmic radiation and become still more powerful. So a fight, of course, breaks out between this newly empowered Fantastic Four knockoff group and the Hulk. And it concludes with the 4 members of the UFOs being killed by their own burgeoning power set. They got their wish. They actually did absorb more cosmic radiation than they knew, and their powers continued expanding to the point that their life systems could no longer support them. Ironclad becomes so dense and metallic that he sinks into the Earth's crust. X-Ray and Vapor both dissipate, and Utrecht, Vector, gets propelled right off the Earth by his own gravitic propulsion powers, while the Hulk just kind of stands there and shrugs the whole thing off. So, this is the introduction of the UFOs, and what was intended, I think, by Mantlo as just a one-off cautionary tale, and also a cheap excuse to have the Hulk fight the Fantastic Four, but not quite, turned into an ongoing cheap excuse for a variety of Marvel Universe writers to have a variety of different Marvel Universe characters fight the Fantastic Four, but not quite. Never again would writers have to contrive reasons, mind control, misunderstanding, etc., for why the real Fantastic Four might fight Marvel Hero X when they had a ready-made villainous analog of the Fantastic Four with slightly variant powers that are ready and willing to fight any heroic figure, no questions asked. And so it was that the UFOs became kind of a Marvel Universe mainstay, coming back again and again. And as a matter of fact, as of this recording, they're due to make yet another return in the pages of the Immortal Hulk in early 2001. So let's all look forward to that. Then I have a comic that's come up in discussion numerous times on Comic Geek Speak, the first issue of the Post-Crisis Justice League series by Keith Giffen, J.M. DeMatteis, and Kevin Maguire and Terry Austin. And if you'd like to hear more comments about that, I won't go into enough said for me for now. Those of you who would like to hear more remarks, who'd like to hear Comic Geek Speak Geekdom Assembled's opinions on Justice League #1, seek out a footnotes episode we did on it in November of 2008. Go there to learn our thoughts on the beginnings of Bwahaha. It's Shane Kelly's time to shine. Then, from actually the very same, the same year, Justice League #1 is cover dated May of '87. Cover date March of '87, we have the 12th issue of the '80s volume of Secret Origins. Yes, the one that, as I mentioned earlier, Mark Waid ended up editing by the end of its 50-issue run. But as of number 12, Roy Thomas is still the man in charge. And as was the pattern for Secret Origins in those days, there are 2 origin stories contained within its pages, one golden age and one more contemporary, although this is something of an exception to that rule. It's the origin of the post-crisis origin of the Challengers of the Unknown, as told by Kirby devotee Mark Evanier and artist Chuck Patton, and also the origin of the Golden Age Fury by Roy Thomas and Tom Greinberg. And the reason I so vocally scare-quoted the term Golden Age in Golden Age Fury is that the Fury is not an authentic Golden Age character. She's actually more of a post-crisis continuity patch, introduced by Thomas to answer the pressing post-crisis question, if there's no longer such a thing, and never has been, as a Golden Age Earth 2 Wonder Woman, then who is the mother of Lyta Trevor, a.k.a. the Fury, of Infinity Inc.? Because remember, Infinity Inc. was a team of the descendants and protégés of Golden Age DC heroes, and their adventures were still ongoing for a year or two after the conclusion of Crisis, so there were lingering questions as to, for example, how the Fury, who was originally conceived as the daughter of the Golden Age Earth 2 Wonder Woman, could still be around if there never was a Golden Age Earth 2 Wonder Woman. Well, Roy Thomas's answer to that question was that post-Crisis, Lyta Trevor was actually the daughter of a young woman named Helena Cosmatos, who, during World War II, merged her essence with that of Tisiphone, the Blood Avenger, one of the Furies of ancient Greek myth, and became the superpowered heroine, the Fury, to protect her homeland of Greece and the rest of the free world from the Nazi menace, and who was also a member of the Young All-Stars team, whose adventures were published in the wake of Crisis and also written by Roy Thomas. So, this Secret Origins issue number 12 is the first full-scale telling of the origin of this newly created, quote-unquote, Golden Age character that Roy Thomas conceived to help answer some of the continuity questions raised by Crisis. Next up, we have issue number 9 of the 70s reprint series Wanted, the World's Most Dangerous Villains, which is a favorite of mine. I think I have a complete run of Wanted now. It was one of the brainchildren of E. Nelson Bridwell, longtime DC Comics writer and editor, unwilling right-hand man of the tyrannical editor Mort Weisinger, and one of my personal heroes. I've come to understand in recent years that Wanted was less an objective showcase of some of the greatest and best-known villains in DC's history, as it was just an excuse for Bridwell to reprint older DC stories, or stories that were originally published by some other publisher in the Golden Age but are now owned by DC. There's stories from DC's back library that Bridwell happened to like, featuring villains that he happened to like. This particular issue, number 9, features a character that I would actually agree with Bridwell as one of the greatest and most dangerous villains of DC's past. One of my favorite Superman villains, the Prankster. It's a classic Golden Age tale of Superman versus the Prankster, and another Golden Age tale of the Sandman and Sandy the Golden Boy up against the villainous Deadly Nightshade. Now let's jump forward in time to a few comics that were published around the turn of the year 2002. We're on the home stretch here, folks. First, we have a very patriotic-looking issue of Superman, Volume 2, number 178. Superman and the Spirit of America reads the cover, and it's got Superman standing arms akimbo in front of an American flag with an eagle spreading its wings on his shoulder. You can tell this is happening post Our Worlds at War because Superman's wearing the red and and black S-shield on his chest, as opposed to the usual red and yellow. It's a part of the Loeb and McGuinness run on Superman. The story inside is called The American Way, and it shows Superman as he decompresses in the wake of the Imperiex War, suddenly finding himself in the middle of a brawl with the embodiment of the spirit of America, Uncle Sam, who, as it turns out, has been corrupted and confused by the fact that the chief figurehead and human representative of the American spirit, the president, happens to be Lex Luthor, and that's what's influencing Uncle Sam to attack Superman while spouting anti-alien, and therefore implicitly anti-immigrant rhetoric, which, as we all know, is very un-American. But then Uncle Sam is brought to his senses by Superman fairly quickly, and the rest of them spend the rest of the issue commiserating over the recent tragedies, real and fictional, that DC Universe America has undergone. They're talking primarily and most literally and directly in story about the destruction of Topeka, Kansas by the Imperiex forces in Our Worlds at War, but there's also mention made of the World Trade Center. Because this is it's significant in that respect. It's one of the earliest DC comics to make direct or indirect mention of the 9/11 tragedies. It's a couple of months after Amazing Spider-Man number 36, the black cover issue written by J. Michael Straczynski, which very directly addressed 9/11, and which I discussed at length in an earlier episode of this very podcast. So Marvel was a bit ahead of the game, a bit ahead of DC on that. But this issue does kind of speak to that, and it's very patriotic in tone. Even the artwork, a lot of it's colored by Tanya and Richard Horry, and a lot of the panels are colored in a patriotic monochrome, either red, white, or blue. As this story of Superman battling Uncle Sam unfolds. It's mentioned in the text that this is the first appearance of Uncle Sam in some time as such, as originally conceived by James Montgomery Flagg and also by Will Eisner as a superheroic comic character in the 40s, after some time spent in the 90s having been reimagined as the more inclusive Patriot character. See John Ostrander's Spectre and the year-long storyline The Haunting of America for more details about that. That whole thing was basically swept under the rug quite deftly by Jeff Loeb here in this story, which returns him to his more familiar depiction in post-traumatic, post-9/11 times when it was assumed that American comic book readers needed the more familiar and comforting icon of Uncle Sam to appear in comics again. And that is what was done here. Also, in kind of a B story, Lex Luthor, the president, as I mentioned before, learns for at least the second time in post-crisis continuity that Superman and Clark Kent are one and the same, and this time he believes it. Dun dun dun. All right, moving on from there, we've got a couple of comics cover dated February of 2002, a pair of superhero murder mysteries, and another common thread between them. They're also both having been published, I guess it would have been December of 2001, but cover dated 2002, as a part of the DC... Well, event is a little too strong a word. Let's say the DC promotion branded as full coverage. And the gimmick there was the covers of all DC comics published during that month featured a much smaller than usual title logo and issue number. It's really reduced to quarter-inch high type up in the upper right-hand corner so that the cover artwork can shine forth. And artists were encouraged to do kind of a Will Eisner-esque incorporation of the title of the series into the actual image on the cover. It was basically a stunt, and it produced some interesting and memorable covers, but it didn't do much to affect what was going on underneath those covers. It wasn't story-based, it was art-based. So anyway, in one of these two stories is, these two issues I'll mention here is The Titans, number 36. No teen, just Titans. There was another Teen Titans team that had been running around for a while. But as of the end of 2001, these are the core original Teen Titans and a few of their friends having adventures as young adults together. The writer at this point was Jay Ferber, guest pencils by Peter Grau. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a murder mystery, and the murder in question was that of the young fiance, much younger, of Golden Age heroine Libby Lawrence Chambers, a.k.a. Liberty Bell, and her daughter, Jessie Quick, was a member of the Titans at this point. And it quickly comes to light that this murdered fiance was a real cad. And for more reasons than one, because A, he was dating Libby in the first place just to exploit her money and fame, and B, because all the while he was having an affair with Jessie. Oh, my lord, is that ever juicy. So, while mother and daughter have to cope with this revelation, they also have to work together with the rest of the Titans team to solve the fiancé's murder. And it turns out that the culprit is another mostly forgotten figure from DC's Golden Age. Interesting stuff there. And in a B story, Beast Boy and Flamebird are trying, and without much success, to mold a group of young superpowered kids, escapees from detention with the DEO, into the new Titans West. And these DEO kids were kind of an important element of Jay Ferber's Titans run. It's just too bad that not much of anyone other than Ferber himself really cared about them as characters. Also worth mentioning that Jessie Quick is wearing that costume, the one with the letter Q around her right breast, which Peter Rios, my friend and colleague, cannot stand. And I can kind of see what he means. And also a part of Full Coverage Month, let's jump over to JSA number 31. Also features a superhero murder mystery, as the JSA has to team up with Batman to solve the murder of an old Batman and the Outsider's opponent, Shakedown of the Masters of Disaster, written by Jeff Johns with awesomely atmospheric art by Peter Snyberg. And the cliffhanger at the end of this issue, Power Girl, for the first time, joins this incarnation of the JSA. Character Jeff Johns had kind of been avoiding dealing with, but once he started writing her in the JSA series, he completely fell in love with her. And the rest is history. And finally, as long promised, last thing I'll mention in this episode, the 10th and final issue of Kevin Smith's introductory Green Arrow arc, Quiver, in Green Arrow number 10, cover dated January of 2002, in which the resting soul of Oliver Queen finally descends, leaving his heavenly reward behind to merge with the body, mind, and soul of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Oliver Queen homunculus, who had been walking the earth with a jumbled and obsolete set of Oliver Queen's old memories, created and set forth into the world by Parallax. Hal Jordan, while he wielded the power of Parallax and was feeling contrite for all the damage he had done as Parallax, that had been the protagonist of the Green Arrow series to this date. But here we finally see the original Ollie's soul descending into this newly created and rejuvenated body, just in time to thwart the wicked demon-worshipping Stanley Dover, who turns out to be the villain of this arc. And so Kevin Smith presents us with a twisted, yet simultaneously rather touching take on the venerable DC concept of Stanley and his monster. The bad guy is vanquished in a very graphic way, and this 10-issue arc ends with Oliver Queen putting his arm around the shoulder of his son Connor Hawke and walking off, determined to first thing in this second chance at life he's been given, to get to know the son that he barely got a chance to get to know in his first go-round. So it's very excellent character-driven comics from Kevin Smith, the beginning of a great arc, and not quite the end, but close to the end of Kevin Smith's run. And it all came out, as promised, in more or less a timely fashion, very few delays. And I think Kevin Smith he produced a work to be proud of, and one that I do recommend to anyone out there listening to this podcast right now. And so, another episode of Murd's Time Bubble draws to a close. And the time, I think, has come to come clean to you all, ebullient ones. This has been a long, strange trip for me. It's been a journey through time in a more than usually literal sense for yours truly. Because, full disclosure time now, I began recording this episode back in late October of 2020, and I actually, for one reason or another, partly due to the onset of the busy Christmas season, but for other reasons which are just my own damn fault, I have not finished recording it until late December of that same year, which would help explain my remark at the beginning of this episode about how you were supposed to have heard this recording in early November, when in fact you're hearing it much later than that. And it also explains my remark that it had been something like 19 months since my last transmission, when now it's much more like 21 months. And further, it explains that cryptic remark maybe a half hour earlier in this same recording, where I said something like, "This has been going on longer than you know." Well, now you do know, my friends, and I can only apologize from this extreme case of delinquency. It's especially in this year, I should have gotten a little more recording done in a more timely fashion, and I simply failed to do so. I'd like to extend a special personal apology, in fact, to CGS and Time Bubble listener Stephen Reed from the plague-ridden British Isles, who, in the midst of the long caesura in my recording of this episode, back around American Thanksgiving, actually sent an email thanking me and the rest of the CGS crew for all the entertainment, Time Bubble episodes in particular, that we had provided him during the long, unexpected, and unwanted stretches of free time he experienced during this year. I'm sure a lot of the rest of you listening can relate. And I've been meaning to do a lot of things during the last couple of months that I never got around to doing, but I had wanted to respond to your email, Stephen. I'm sorry that I never did get around to doing so, and I hope that this personal valediction here on the air will be an adequate substitute. So, once again, I'm sorry to all of you. I really meant to get this episode out much earlier than I did. I'd meant to begin recording it much earlier than late October, for that matter, so the delay of this episode becomes that much greater and more shameful when you take that into account. But I was bound and determined to get this episode out before the end of this embattled year of 2020, and as it turns out, like most other things that happened in 2020, this episode of the Time Bubble turned out to be weird, prolonged, badly delayed, and just not as good as it should have been. So, I'm sorry. I thank you all for bearing with me. I'm glad that I was at least able to get this to you before this year was out. And now, my friends, I'm jumping back into the cockpit of the Time Bubble and getting the hell out of this year as quickly as possible. It does my heart good to know that the rest of you who are forced to travel through time the hard way, i.e. by living through it, will be following me out the door in short order. So my next destination will probably be the year 2022, and as soon as they let me out of quarantine there, I'll poke around and see if a vaccine is available yet. I'll let you guys know what I find out. So hopefully I'll be able to check back with you in happier times in the year 2021. Best not to make any promises, I think, at this point, given my track record. But, hey, at least I do know of at least one of the comics I'll be discussing at that time. And it's a real Bronze Age curiosity that I'm kind of excited to talk about at some length. Hopefully not too great length. But so until whatever time we do meet again, all of you stay well, stay healthy. Check out the CGS forums and the CGS supergroup on Facebook for an opportunity to talk back about the things I discussed on this episode. Have a happy new year, and I will talk to you all next time.